The Way Through the Woods by Colin Dexter. Read by Kevin Whately. Chief Inspector Morse of Thames Valley CID never took his fair share of holidays. So he told himself. So he was telling Chief Superintendent Strange that morning in early June. "It gets tricky," commented Strange, "when a senior man takes more than a fortnight's furlough. Where were you thinking of?" "Lyme Regis." "Ah, glorious Devon." "Dorset, sir." "Well, next door, surely." "You couldn't stick being away that long. Building sand castles for over a fortnight?" "Coleridge country, sir. I'll probably drive around a bit, have a look at Ottery St. Mary. You won't last the distance. You'll be back in Oxford within the week, you'll see." The proprietor of the only hotel on the Marine Parade pushed the register across, and Morse quickly completed the date, name, address, car registration, nationality columns. As he did so, it was out of long habit, rather than any interest or curiosity, that his eye took in just a few details about the half-dozen or so persons, single and married, who had signed in just before him. "Enjoy your stay with us." The proprietor handed Morse 2 keys on a ring, one to room 27, one for the hotel's garage. "If you'd just like to get your luggage out, I'll see it's taken up to your room while you put the car away. The police allow our guests to park temporarily, of course, but—" Morse looked down at the street map given to him and turned to go. "Thanks very much. I don't want any trouble with the police. Funny lot sometimes." A few minutes after Morse had driven the maroon Jaguar slowly along the lower road, a woman turned into the Bay Hotel. She had just returned from a walk along the upper level of Marine Parade. "No calls for me?" she asked when the proprietor reappeared. "No, Mrs. Harding. There's been nothing else." "Okay." But she said it in such a way as if it weren't okay. Already 2 couples were seated in the bar, enjoying their dry sherries. "I think I'll have a large malt," she said to the barman. "On your room bill, Mrs. Harding?" "Please, room 14. The whiskey tasted good. The Times lay on the coffee table beside her, and she picked it up, turned to the back page, and studied one across. Some 20 minutes later, her not inconsiderable cruciverbalist skills had coped with all but a couple of clues. One of them a tantalizingly half-familiar quotation from Samuel Taylor Coleridge, over which she was still frowning when the lady of the establishment interrupted her with the evening's menu. For a few minutes, after ordering seafood soup with fresh garden herbs, followed by guinea fowl in leek and mushroom sauce, she sat with eyes downcast and smoked a king-sized Dunhill cigarette. Then, as if on sudden impulse, she went into the glass-panelled telephone booth that stood beside the entrance and rang a number. Inside the private garage for residents of the Bay Hotel, Morse saw there were 18 parking spaces, marked out in diagonal white lines. It was out of habit, as before, that he scanned the number plates of the cars there. But when, about a quarter of an hour earlier, he'd glanced through the hotel register, at least something had clicked in his mind. Now, though, nothing. Nothing at all. The drinks bar faced him as he turned into the hotel, so he ordered a pint of best bitter and sat down. At that particular moment, he longed for both the things he had that very morning solemnly avowed to eschew for the remaining days of his leave: cigarettes and newspapers. His right hand was feeling instinctively for the reassuring square packet in his jacket pocket, when the maitre d'hotel appeared, wished him a warm welcome, and gave him the menu. Morse had no hesitation in choosing the seafood soup and the guinea fowl. "Something to drink with your meal, sir?" "What do you recommend?" "Half a bottle of Medoc. Splendid vintage. You won't do much better than that." A bottle might be better," suggested Morse. "A bottle it shall be, sir." He was glad to be informed when his meal was ready. The dining room looked inviting, romantic almost. Morse followed the good lady to one of the furthest tables, where an empty place was laid opposite a woman, herself seated half facing the wall, reading a copy of the Times. She lowered the newspaper, smiled in a genteel sort of way, before reverting her attention to something clearly more interesting than her table companion. It was over the main course, his only slightly after hers, that Morse ventured his first not exactly original gambit. "Been here long?" She shook her head. "Nor me. Only just arrived, in fact." "And me." She could speak. "I'm only here for a few days." "Me too." It was the longest passage of speech Morse was likely to get, he knew. "Bugger you," thought Morse. Yet his interest, in spite of himself, was beginning to be engaged. A full mouth was undoubtedly attractive, but he noticed something else as well. She might have been weeping a little. When the sweet trolley came, Morse was glad that he was only halfway down the Medoc. Some cheese would go nicely with it. He ordered Stilton. "Would you, like a glass of wine? Rather good. It'll go nicely with the Stilton." This time she merely shook her head. She picked up the Times once more, unfolded the whole broadsheet in front of her, and hid herself away completely, together with her troubles. The fingers holding the paper, Morse noticed, quite slim and sinuous. On the third finger of her left hand was a narrow-banded gold wedding ring. On the left of the open double-page spread, as Morse viewed things, a right hand held the newspaper just above the crossword, and he noticed that only 2 clues remained to be solved. It was the other half of the paper, though, held rather nearer to him, especially with the article, the quite extraordinary article, that suddenly caught and held and dominated his attention. At the foot of the page was the headline, "Police Pass Sinister Verses to Times Man," and Morse had almost made out the whole of the first paragraph when the waitress returned to the table. "Coffee, madam?" "Please." "In the bar or in the lounge?" "In the bar, I think." "You, sir?" No, thank you." On the other side of the table the newspaper was folded away. Curiously, however, neither seemed over-anxious to leave immediately, and for several moments they sat silently together. "Would you mind if I smoked?" he ventured, half reaching for the tempting packet. "It doesn't matter to me." She rose abruptly. "But I don't think the management will be quite so accommodating." She pointed briefly to a no-smoking notice beside the door. "Bugger you," thought Morse. He'd not been very sensible, though, he realized that. All he'd had to do was to ask to borrow the newspaper for a couple of minutes. He could still ask her, of course, but he wasn't going to. Oh, no. She could stick a bloody paper down the loo for all he cared. Almost every newsagent in Lyme Regis would have a few unsold copies of yesterday's newspapers. She'd go to the bar, she'd said. All right. He would go to the lounge. In the bar, Mrs. Harding was drinking her coffee, sipping a Cointreau, and, if truth be told, thinking, for just a little while, of the keen blue eyes of the man who had been sitting opposite her at dinner. At 7 o'clock the next morning, the newsagent on the corner felt pretty sure that he hadn't got a previous day's Times. Sun, yes. Mirror, yes. Express, yes. But no Times. Sorry, mate. Turning left, Morse struggled up the steep incline of Broad Street. 3 more newsagents were likewise unable to assist. Strolling back along the front, Morse breathed deeply on the early morning air. He stopped as he caught sight of a figure in front of him, about 200 yards distant. Beneath the white canopy of the buff-coloured Bay Hotel stood Mrs. Harding, Mrs. Crab Crumpet herself, dressed in a full-length black leather coat. She raised her right hand in greeting as a taxi drew up along the lower road. Inside the Bay Hotel, the ground floor was still deserted. Morse was starting up the stairs when his eye fell on the reception desk and the hotel register. He glanced around. No one. He looked swiftly along the linear information once again. 3rd of the 7th, 92. Mr. and Mrs. C. A. Harding, 16 Cathedral Mews, Salisbury. H35 LWL, British, room 14. It had been an Oxfordshire letter registration, LWL, which had caught his eye that previous evening. Now it was something else. That initial, C. It was crossed out. It was her, all right, though, for he'd seen the room number on her keyring at dinner. Breakfast, 8:45 a.m. to 9:30 a.m., was for Morse a solitary affair. The weather forecast was good, and he decided that he would drive out west to Ottery St. Mary. As he reached the second-floor landing, after his return to the hotel, room 14 was almost directly in front of him, and with the door slightly ajar, he could see a maid inside the room. He took his chance. He put his head around the door. "Mrs. Harding in?" "No, sir." She looked no more than 18. "It's just that she promised to keep yesterday's newspaper for me. The Times, it was." The maid gave Morse a dubious look as he cast a swift glance over the room. The bed nearer the window had been slept in, the pillow deeply indented, a flimsy black negligée thrown carelessly over the duvet. But had Mr. Harding slept in the other? "I'm afraid there's no newspaper as I can see here, sir." Morse smiled affably. "It's all right. Sorry to have bothered you." Back in room 27 he stood for several minutes looking out at the sea again, and wondering why the brown leather suitcase he'd just seen in room 14 bore, in an attractive Gothic script, the gilt letters CSO. Must be her initials, surely. But it was fairly obvious that the O didn't stand for Harding. So what, Morse? So bloody what? He sat down and wrote a note. "Dear Mrs. H, I shall be most grateful if you can save yesterday's Times for me. I only really want to look at the bit on page 1 about the Sinister Verses article. Your reward, which you must accept, will be a drink on me at the bar before dinner. Room 27. Leaving this innocent, if rather pompous, communication with the proprietor, Morse walked along to the private garage, pondering the reason why the female half of room 14 had not made use of car H35 LWL instead of ordering a taxi. By the time he reached Honiton, Morse had almost forgotten the rather odd fact that when he had looked just now round the other cars in the hotel garage, there'd been no sign whatever of any vehicle with the registration H35 LWL. Extract from a diary dated 26th June 1992, 1 week before Morse had found himself in Lyme Regis. Words. Someone, a Yank, I think, said you can stroke people with words. Looking through the P's, I found pornography again. Words. Bloody hell, God help me. Common subjects of such exotic pornography as sadism, masochism, fetishism, transvestitism, voyeurism, narcissism, pederasty, and necrophilia. Less common subjects are coprophilia, kleptolagnia, and zoophilia. Should it be a fraction of comfort that my tastes don't yet run to these last 3 less common perversions, if that's the right word. Later, in senior common room. Very good. Babu Houseman. I phoned C afterwards, and I almost dare to believe she's really looking forward to next weekend. Oh, God. Let me sleep well. In mid-afternoon, Morse looked back on his Coleridge pilgrimage with considerable disappointment. It was whilst lying fully clothed on his single bed back at the hotel, staring soberly at the ceiling, that there was a knock on the door. "Mrs. Harding wanted you to have this, Mr. Morse," said the proprietor. "She insisted I gave it to you personally." What was all this to Morse's ears? Music. Music. Heavenly music. Inside the carrier bag was the coveted copy of the Times, together with a Bay Hotel envelope, inside which was a brief letter.
for 27 from 14. I've seen a paperback called The Bitch by one of the Collins sisters. I've not read it, but I think it must be all about me, don't you? If I'm not at dinner, I'll probably be in soon after, and if you're still around, you can buy me a brandy. For Morse, this innocent missive was balm and manna to his soul. Strangely, though, before reading the article, he picked up the bedside phone and dialed Police HQ at Kidlington. Inside the newspaper, he read, "Police pass sinister verses to Times man." The literary correspondent of the Times, Mr. Howard Phillipson, has been called upon by the Oxfordshire police to help solve a complex riddle-me-ree, the answer to which is believed to pinpoint the spot where a young woman's body may be buried. The riddle, in the form of a 5-stanza poem, was sent anonymously by a person who, as the police believe, knows the secret of a crime which for 12 months has remained on the unsolved case shelves in the Thames Valley Police HQ at Kidlington, Oxfordshire. According to Detective Chief Inspector Harold Johnson of Thames Valley CID, the poem would fairly certainly appear to have reference to the disappearance of a Swedish student, whose rucksack was found in a lay-by on the northbound carriageway of the A44, a mile or so south of Woodstock, in July 1991. Documents found in the side panels of the rucksack had identified its owner as Karin Eriksson, a student from Uppsala, who had probably hitchhiked her way from London to Oxford, spent a day or so in the university city, and then, who knows? The case was always a baffling one, admitted DCI Johnson. No body was ever found, no suspicious circumstances uncovered, but we've always thought of this as a potential murder. The principal of the secretarial college where Karen was a student in Sweden described her as an attractive, able and athletic young lady. The poem in full reads as follows. Find me. Find the Swedish daughter. Thaw my frosted tegument. Dry the azure skylit water. Sky my everlasting tent. Who spied that awful spot? Oh, find me, find the woodman's daughter. Ask the stream, why tell'st me not the truth thou knowest, the tragic slaughter? Ask the tiger, ask the sun, whither riding, what my plight? Till the given day be run, till the burning of the night. Time I saw time flowering here, a creature white trapped in a gin, panting like a hunted deer, licking still the bloodied skin. With clues surveyed so wondrous laden, hunt the ground beneath my feet. Find me now, thy maiden, I will kiss thee when we meet. A. Austin, 1853–87. The lines were typed on a fairly old-fashioned machine. The only immediately observable idiosyncrasies of the typewriter used are the worn top segment of the lowercase e and the slight curtailment of the crossbar in the lowercase t. To be truthful, admitted Chief Inspector Johnson, not many of my colleagues here are all that hot on poetry, and that's why we thought the Times might help. Morse read the article at his own pace. Then again, rather more quickly. Then he turned to the back page and reread the clue he hadn't quite been able to see the evening before. Work without hope draws nectar in a... Coleridge. 5 letters. The poem was a riddle, so was the answer. Quotation from Coleridge, too. Half smiling, he marvelled once more at the frequency of that extraordinarily common phenomenon called coincidence. Had he but known it, however, a far greater coincidence had already occurred the previous evening, when, purely by chance surely, he had been ushered into the dining-room to share a table with the delectable occupant of room 14. But as yet he couldn't know such a thing. He reached for the telephone again. "Put me through to traffic control, will you?" he said. Morse made his way from the dining room to the bar. He'd enjoyed his meal. Venison, no less. He now ordered a pint of best bitter and sat down, his back to the sea, with the current issue of the Times. As he struggled a little over the last two clues of the crossword, he heard her voice. "Not finished it yet?" Morse felt a sudden rush of happiness. "You got the paper?" Morse nodded his gratitude. "Yes." "Why don't you offer me a cigarette?" Morse's newfound happiness scaled yet another peak. "What's your name?" she asked. "Morse. They call me Morse." "Odd name. What's your surname?" "That is my surname." "Oh, as well. Your name's Morse Morse. Like that man in Catch-22, isn't it? Major, Major, Major." "Didn't he have 4 majors?" "You read a lot?" "Enough." "What's your name?" "Louisa." "And what do you do, Louisa?" "I work for a model agency." "No, that's wrong. I am a model agency." "Where are you from?" "From a little village just south of Salisbury, along the Chalk Valley." Morse nodded vaguely. "Coombe-Bissett? Near there, is it?" "Quite near, yes." "But what about you? What do you do?" "I work in an office." "Whereabouts is that?" "Oxford." "Oh, lovely city. You know Oxford." "Why don't you buy me a large brandy?" she asked softly in his ear. Morse put the drinks on his room bill and returned with 1 large brandy and 1 large malt scotch. "Cheers." "Cheers." "You're a liar," she said. The 3 words hit Morse like an uppercut. She continued mercilessly. "You're a copper." Duh. "Is it that obvious?" "Oh, no. Not obvious at all. I just saw your name and address in the register, and my husband, well, he happens to have heard of you. He says you're supposed to be a bit of a whiz-kid in the crime world. That's all. You deny it? You deny you're a copper?" Morse shook his head. "No. It's just that when you're on holiday, well, sometimes you want to get away from the work you do, and sometimes you tell a few lies, I suppose. Everyone tells a few lies occasionally." "They do?" "Oh, yes." "Everyone?" Morse nodded. "Including you." He turned towards her again. "Go on," she said quietly. "I think you're a divorced woman having an affair with a married man who lives in Oxford. I think the pair of you occasionally get the opportunity of a weekend together. I think that when you do, you need an accommodation address, and that you use your own address, which is not in the Chalk Valley, but in the Cathedral Close at Salisbury. I think you came here by coach on Friday afternoon, and that your partner was scheduled to get here at the same time as you, but he didn't show up. And since you'd already booked your double room, you registered and took your stuff up to your room, including a suitcase with the initials CSO on it. You suspected something had gone sadly wrong, but as yet you daren't use the phone to find out. You had no option but to wait. I think a call did come through eventually, which upset you. This morning you hired a taxi to take you to meet this fellow who had let you down, and I think you've spent the day together somewhere. Another drink?" "Yes, but I'll get them." The voice was matter-of-fact, harder now, and Morse knew that the wonderful magic had faded. "What about this married man who lives in Oxford?" she asked when she returned. "Oh, I know all about him." "You what?" "I rang up the Thames Valley Police. You put any car number through the computer there, you get the name and address of the owner in about 10 seconds. About 2 seconds, amended Morse. And you did that? I did that. God, you're a regular shit, aren't you? Her eyes blazed with anger now. It's funny, though, said Morse, ignoring the hurt. I know his name, but I still don't know yours. Louisa, I told you. No, I think not. She stood up. Claire Osborne, that's my name. Well, thanks again for the paper, Claire. It's all right? Her eyes were suddenly moist with tears. Shall I see you for breakfast? Asked Morse. No, I'm leaving early. I see, said Morse. Perhaps you see too much. Perhaps I don't see enough. Good night, Morse. Good night. Good night, Claire. Claire Osborne lay awake into the small hours, the duvet kicked aside. Half of her thoughts were still with the conceited, civilized, ruthless, gentle, boozy, sensitive man with whom she'd spent the earlier hours of that evening. The other half were with Alan Harding, Dr. Alan Harding, Fellow of Lonsdale College, Oxford, whose young daughter Sarah had been killed by an articulated lorry as she had cycled down Cumnor Hill on her way to school the previous morning. On June the 29th, 5 days before Morse had booked into the Bay Hotel, the Chief Constable had returned from a fortnight's furlough. The letter containing the Swedish maiden verse had been in the in-tray, or so his secretary thought, for about a week. It had come in a cheap brown envelope addressed to Chief Constable Smith, ? But that had been thrown away, sorry. He had rung Strange, who in turn had reminded the CC that it was DCI Johnson who was in charge of the earlier investigations. A photocopy of the poem was waiting on his desk that day when Johnson returned from lunch. It had been the following morning, however, when things had really started to happen. This time, certainly it was a cheap brown envelope addressed to Chief Constable Smith, ? Kidlington Police, Kidlington, with a Woodstock postmark, and a smudged date that could have been 27th of June, that was received in the post room at HQ. The letter was extremely brief. Why are you doing nothing about my letter? Karen Eriksson. The notepaper clearly came from the same wad as that used for the first letter. There was every sign, too, that the note was written on the same typewriter. This time, the CC summoned Strange immediately to his office. Prince? Suggested Strange, looking up from the envelope. Waste of bloody time. What about the letter itself? You can try if you like. I'll get Johnson onto it. No, I don't want Johnson. I want Morse on it. He's on holiday. First I've heard of it. You've been on holiday, sir. For a while Strange sat thinking silently. Then he said, Do you remember that correspondence they had in the Times a year or so back? Well, the Irish business, yes. I was just thinking aloud, sir, that if you were to ring the Times... Me? What's wrong with you ringing 'em? The Chief Superintendent lumbered towards the door. There you are, then, said Strange to Chief Inspector Harold Johnson. That's what I reckon we ought to do. Cause a bit of a stir, wouldn't it? Johnson nodded. I like it. Will you ring the Times, sir? What's wrong with you ringing 'em? Strange continued. And while I'm here, you might as well remind me about the case. Karen Eriksson had been a missing person inquiry a year ago when her rucksack had been found. She was a missing person inquiry now. What was known about Miss Eriksson? Her mother had run a small guest house in Uppsala, but soon after the disappearance of her daughter had moved back to Stockholm. Karen, the middle of 3 daughters, had just completed a secretarial course. She was, as all agreed, of the classic Nordic type,
with long blonde hair and a bosom which was liable to monopolize most men's attention when first they met her. She was a tallish, 5'8.5", large-boned, athletic young lady who could take fairly good care of herself, thank you very much. The records showed that Karen had flown to Heathrow on Wednesday the 3rd of July, 1991, with almost £200. A few days in London had apparently dissipated a large proportion of her English currency, and fairly early in the morning of Sunday the 7th of July, she had taken the tube, perhaps, to Paddington, from where, perhaps, she had made her way up to the A40-M40 towards Oxford. The statement made by a YWCA superintendent firmly suggested that, from what Karen had told her, she would probably be heading, in the long run, for a distant relative living in mid-Wales. She would have been a distinctive figure. Longish, straw-coloured hair, wearing a pair of faded blue jeans. Particularly noticeable, this from several witnesses, would have been the yellow and blue Swedish flag, some 9 inches by 6 inches, stitched across the main back pocket of her rucksack. And around her neck, always, a silk tasselled scarf in the same national colours, sunshine and sky. 2 witnesses had come forward with fairly positive sightings of a woman answering Karen's description, trying to hitch a lift between Headington and the Banbury roundabouts in Oxford. And 1 further witness, a youth waiting for a bus at the top of the Banbury Road in Oxford, thought he remembered seeing her walking fairly purposefully down towards Oxford that day. The time? About noon. At about 7:15, Johnson continued, on the sunny Tuesday morning of 9th of July 1991, George Daly, of 2 Blenheim Villas, Begbrook, Oxon, had taken his 8-year-old King Charles Spaniel for an early morning walk along the slip road beside the Royal Sun, a mile or so on the Oxford side of Woodstock. At the bottom of a hawthorn hedge, Daly had spotted, as he claimed, a splash of bright colour, and as he ventured near he had all but trodden on a camera before seeing the scarlet rucksack. It was the camera that had claimed most of Daly's attention. He'd promised a camera to his son Philip, a lad just coming up for his 16th birthday. Both the rucksack and the camera he'd taken home, where he and his wife Margaret had considered things. The rucksack, clearly and specifically, belonged to someone else. But the camera had no name on it, had it? For all they knew, it had no connection at all with the rucksack. So they'd taken out the film, which seemed to be fully used up anyway, and thrown it on the fire. Not a crime, was it? The wife, Margaret Daly, felt a bit guilty about hanging on to the rucksack, and according to Daly, persuaded him to drop it in at Kidlington the next day, Wednesday, originally asserting that he'd found it that same morning. But it wasn't long before he changed his story. The rucksack itself, it contained presumably all the young woman's travelling possessions, including a passport which identified its owner as one Karen Eriksson, from an address in Uppsala, Sweden. Among other things, a slim money wallet was found, containing no credit cards or travellers' cheques. Just 5 £10 notes, newish, but not consecutively numbered, and the address of the Welsh relative. Well, Interpol were contacted, and of course the Swedish police. The next thing, Johnson continued his story, had been the discovery in the long grass, about 20 yards from where the rucksack had been found, of a slim little volume titled A Birdwatcher's Guide. Inside was a sheet of white paper, on which the names of 10 birds had been written in neat capitals, with a penciled tick against 7 of them. Hobby, tick. Red kite, lesser spotted woodpecker, breaded tit, tick. Corn bunting, tick. Tree pipit, tick. Redstart, tick. Nightingale, tick. Grasshopper, warbler, tick. Nuthatch. Even more interesting, though, had been the second enclosure within the pages, a thin yellow leaflet announcing a pop concert in the grounds of Blenheim Palace on Monday the 8th of July, the day before the rucksack was found. 8 p.m. to 11:30 p.m. Admission, ticket only, £4.50. That was it. Nothing else, really. Statements taken, inquiries made,
Searches organised in the grounds of Blenheim Palace, but... How much did Morse come into all this? Asked a frowning Strange. The truth was that Morse had not figured on the scene at all during the first few days of the case, for it was not a case of homicide. I reckon he thought it all a bit of a joke, sir, quite honestly.
Joke? Joke? This is no bloody joke, Johnson.
No, all I'm saying is that he didn't seem to take the case at all seriously. He was sort of silly about things, really. Strange's voice sounded suddenly thunderous. Look here, Johnson. Morse may be an idiot, you're right. But he's never been a fool. Let's get that straight. For Johnson, the differentiation between what he had hitherto regarded as virtual synonyms, idiot and fool, was clearly beyond his etymological capacities. He looked down at the file in front of him. Would you rather Morse took over the case, sir? Yes, I think I would, said Strange. So would the CC, if you must know, he added cruelly. So when does he get back from leave? Strange sighed deeply. Not soon enough. Let's see what happens with the newspaper angle. He's pretty sure to see it if they print it. What, Morse? Nonsense. Never seen him reading anything. Spends half an hour on the crossword, that's all. 10 minutes last time I watched him, said Johnson honestly, if somewhat grudgingly. Wasted his life, Morse has, confided Strange after a pause. Or should have got married, do you mean? Strange began to extricate himself from his chair. Oh, I wouldn't go as far as that. He looked down on the papers that Johnson had been consulting. Isn't that Morse's writing? Queried presbyopically. Yes, it was Morse's handwriting. Johnson handed it over. It read, I never got to grips with the case, as you know, but I'd have liked answers to the following half-dozen questions. A. Had Daly or his missus owned a camera themselves? B. What was the weather like on Tuesday the 9th of July? C. It's striped. What about the panties? 5 letters. D. What's the habitat of Dendrocopus minor? E. What beer do they serve at the Royal Sun, or at the White Hart? F. What's the dog's name? Strange now lumbered to the door. Don't ignore all this bloody nonsense, Johnson. Don't take too much notice of it, but don't ignore it. Understand? As you say, sir. Anything else Morse said? Pursued Strange. Oh, yes, he thought... He said he had a gut feeling... that we'd been searching for the body in the wrong place. In Blenheim, you mean? Johnson nodded. He thought we ought to have been looking in Whittam Woods. Yes. I remember him saying that. On the 6th of July, 6 days after this meeting between Strange and Johnson, Morse had his last breakfast at the Bay Hotel. As he waited for his mixed grill, he reread the article, promised the previous Friday by Howard Phillipson, literary editor of the Times. A preliminary analysis. Interest in the Swedish maiden verses printed in these columns last week, Friday, July the 3rd, has been sweeping this newspaper's offices. But I am myself now somewhat more diffident than I originally was about solving the fascinating riddle-me-ree presented by the 5 stanzas. Clearly the poem is cast in a sylvan setting. We have woodman, stream, time flowering, trapped, hunted deer, etc. There will be no prizes, I realize, for such an analysis, but the neglect of the obvious is always the beginning of unwisdom. The setting of some wood or forest, therefore, must be our Donne. Let us now turn to the mort of the stanzas. The speaker of the poem, the persona, is clearly no longer a living being, yet her dramatic message is quite unequivocal. She has been murdered. She has been drowned in one of the woods. If such waters are searched and dredged, her corpse will be found. What can be gathered from the nature of the verses themselves? Their composer is certainly no Herrick or Houseman,
Yet in terms of technical prosody, the writer is more than competent. Vocabulary, tegument, Asiad, etc., is more redolent of the senior common room than the saloon bar. My firm conviction is that the verses have been sent to the police by a person for whom the period, now a year, between the murder of Karen Eriksson and the present time, has become an intolerable hell. A person who is very near to breaking point. A person who wishes the crime at last to be uncovered, and who is now prepared to pay the penalty. Morse spent the last 3 days of his West Country holiday at the King's Arms in Dorchester. On the Thursday morning, he drove out through the countryside that provided much of the setting for Tess of the d'Urbervilles. As he was driving through Moreton, he wondered whether there was any follow-up to the Philipson analysis, and he stopped and bought the last copy of the Times from the village newsagents. The answer was yes. Yes, there was. And he sat for a while in the sunshine reading the letter. From Professor Emeritus René Gray. Sir, my mind has been much exercised these past few days following the publication, July the 3rd, of the letter received by the Thames Valley Police. I beg the courtesy of your columns to make an observation. This is not a poem by Alfred Austin, though the words A. Austin appear beneath it. The dates given are not Austin the poet's dates. He was born in 1835 and died in 1913. There is a remote possibility that the last 2 digits of his birth date have been transposed for some reason, but the death date is plainly wrong. Dying in 1913, he was 78 years old at the time of his death. By a strange coincidence, the transposition of these digits gives us the 87, which is written here. I conclude that the dates are not all they seem, and most likely constitute the key to the cipher. Lewis received a card from Dorchester the following morning. The message written in Morse's small, neat and scholarly hand. Mostly, I've not been quite so miserable since last year's holiday, but things are looking up here in D. Warmest regards to you and to Mrs. Lewis, but not to any of our other colleagues. Have you been following the Swedish lass? I reckon I know what the poem means. Definitely home sat, M. This card, with its curmudgeonly message, was delivered to Police HQ in Kidlington. Since Morse had not quite been able to remember Lewis's Headington address, and by the time it was in Lewis's hands, almost everyone in the building had read it. Extract from a diary dated Friday the 10th of July, 1992. Please God, may she not be dead. Those words, the ones I so recently wrote, for them may I be forgiven. Those terrible words, when I disavowed my love for my own flesh and blood, for my own children, for my daughter. Everyone forgive me. Had I still belief in God, I would seek to pray, but I cannot. Let it be known that tomorrow I shall once more be happy. Some of tomorrow's hours will bring me happiness again. She is coming. She is coming here. Claire Osborne turned right from the A40 down into Banbury Road. She experienced an unexpected feeling of delight as she parked her Metro MG. What a disaster not taking that to Lyme. In front of the double-fronted Cotswold house, built of honey-coloured Cotswold stone in the leafy environs of North Oxford. She rang the bell at the front door, on which a white notice announced, "No vacancies." But Claire had earlier found a vacancy, and booked it. A vacancy for 2. The door was opened by a tall, slim man with a soft Irish brogue. "Hello." "Hello, my name's Mrs. Harding, and I think you'll find—" "Already phoned, Mrs. Harding, and I'm Jim O'Kane." O'Kane selected a key from somewhere and led the way up a semicircular staircase. "Good journey." "No problems." O'Kane walked across the landing, inserted a key in room 1, and opened the door. "The key fits your room here and the front door, Mrs. Harding." "Fine." Claire looked down at the single key. "My husband's been held up in London." "No problem." When he had gone, Claire looked around her. For a while she sat on the floral-printed bedspread, and then went to the window and looked out. Then Her heart was suddenly pounding against her ribs. A man was walking along the pavement towards the roundabout. He wore a pink, short-sleeved shirt, and his forearms were bronzed, as if perhaps he might recently have spent a few days beside the sea. What an amazing coincidence, the man might have thought, as she pushed open the diamond-leaded window and shouted, "Hi, remember me? Lyme Regis, last weekend?" But that would have been to misunderstand matters, for in truth there was no coincidence at all. Claire Osborne had seen to that. It was not until just before 9 p.m. that Dr. Alan Harding arrived, explaining, excusing, but as vulnerable, as loving as ever, and almost, as she later told herself, that Claire Osborne enjoyed the couple of hours they'd spent together that night between the immaculately laundered sheets of room 1 in the Cotswold house in North Oxford. Morse had arrived home at 2:30 p.m. that same day. No one, as far as he knew, was aware that he had returned, except Lewis. Yet Strange had telephoned at 4 p.m. Would Morse be happy to take on the case? Well, whether he would be happy or not, Morse was going to take on the case. What case? Morse had asked, disingenuously. Strange had been really quite pleased with all the publicity. Seldom had there been such national interest in a purely notional murder. He would feel so very much happier, though, if Morse could take over the responsibility of the case. Thus it was that Strange had rung Morse that Saturday afternoon. In the small hours of Sunday the 12th of July, Claire Osborne still lay awake. It had been all right. It usually was all right. She liked Alan well enough, but she could never be in love with him. Alan Harding had earlier said little about the terrible accident. A few stonily spoken details about the funeral, about the little service they were going to hold at the school. But Claire had not questioned him about any aspect of his own grief. She would, she knew, be trespassing upon a territory that was not, and never could be, hers. At the breakfast table the following morning, she explained briefly that her husband had been called away, and that there would be just her. 10 minutes before Claire had put in an appearance, Jim O'Kane had spotted the photograph. Surely he'd seen that young girl before. He took the Sunday Times through to his wife in the kitchen. "You recognise her?" Anne O'Kane stared at the photograph for a few seconds. "Should I?" "I think I do. You remember that young blonde girl who called about a year ago when we had a vacancy one Sunday? And then she called again later, when we hadn't." "Oh, yes, I do remember," Anne said slowly. She looked up at her husband. "You don't mean—" But Jim O'Kane did mean. Claire was on her last piece of toast when she found her hostess standing beside her with a newspaper. "We pinched this for a minute. I hope you don't mind." "Of course not." "It's just that—" Anne pointed to the reproduction. "Well, it looks a bit like a young girl who called here once. A young girl who disappeared about a year ago." "Long time a year is." "Yes, but my Jim, my husband, he doesn't often forget faces, and I think," she added quietly, "I think he's right." Claire glanced down at the photograph and the article, betraying, she trusted, not a hint of her excitement. "You'd better tell them. The police, hadn't you?" "I suppose so. Jim met one of the men from CID recently at a charity do. We could tell him. This girl I'm thinking of called and asked if we'd got a room, and then when she knew what it would cost, she just sort of... Well, I think she couldn't afford it. Then she called back later, this same girl. And you were full?" Anne O'Kane nodded sadly. "What's the name of this CID man? Lord Peter Wimsey?" "Morse. Chief Inspector Morse." "What the hell are you doing here?" Is that what she'd expected him to say? But he said nothing as he opened the door, stood to one side, and ushered her in. She found herself in a large lounge with 2 settees facing each other. Music was playing, something with a sort of heavyweight sadness about it which she thought she almost recognized.
Very haunting and beautiful. Oh, no need to turn it off for me, you know. Of course not. Wagner, was it? Morse's eyes lit up with some interest. It does show some Wagnerian harmonic and melodic traits, I agree. You're pretending you're not surprised to see me. No, I'm not. I saw you sitting outside the Cotswold house yesterday, smoking a cigarette. Why didn't you say hello? She asked. I was on the opposite side of the road. Not very pally, was it? Why didn't you say hello to me? I didn't see you. I think you did, though. His voice was suddenly gentle. I think you saw me late Saturday afternoon as well, just after you'd arrived. You saw me? You saw me when you walked by with your booze? Morse nodded. Blast him. I suppose you think you know why I've come here now? Morse nodded again. Jim, Mr. O'Kane, he rang me yesterday. About this? She held up the newspapers. About the girl possibly calling there, yes. They're going to make a statement. Not to me, though. I'm on holiday, remember? So it's a bit of a wasted journey. I was going to tell you... Not a wasted journey, don't say that. I don't suppose I can pour you a glass of wine? What on earth makes you suppose that? Quite good, she commented a minute or so later. Not bad, is it? You need a lot of it, though. She smiled attractively. I see you finished the crossword. Yes, it's always easy on a Monday. Did you know that? A lot of people take the Times just for the crossword. Yes. And the letters, of course. And the letters, Morse repeated slowly. Claire unfolded her own copy of the Times, 13th of July, and read aloud a portion of a front-page article. Clues to missing student. Chief Superintendent Strange of Thames Valley CID believes that the ingenious suggestions received in one of the latest communications concerning the disappearance of Karen Eriksson, see letters, page 15, is the most interesting and potentially the most significant hitherto received. He must have read that. Yes. He picked up his own copy and turned to page 15. Obviously a very clever fellow, the one who wrote that, she remarked. Morse read the name aloud. Mr. Lionel Regis. See the address? Morse looked down again and shook his head. Don't know Salisbury very well. It's my address. Really? So are you saying you wrote this? Stop it! She almost shrieked. You wrote it! You saw my address in the visitor's book at Lyme Regis, and you needed an address for this letter. Morse said nothing. You did write it, didn't you? Yes. Why? Why go to all this silly palaver? I just picked someone from the top of my mind, that's all. And you were there, Claire. Right at the top. There were just the two of them in Strange's office the following morning, Tuesday, the 14th of July. Strange turned to Lewis. You realize it's the break, don't you? Lewis, like every other police officer at HQ, had read the letter, but he couldn't understand why Strange had asked him along that morning. He should by rights have been abed. Lewis, you're listening, aren't you? Sorry, sir. You do remember Morse belly-aching about transferring the search from Blenheim to Whittam? Yes, sir. I'm not sure where I come into all this, he began. Well, I'll tell you. There's only one thing you can do, and I can't, Sergeant, and that's to get the morose old bugger back to work here, smartish. In his office, Strange picked up the cutting from the Times and read part of the letter again. Quite extraordinary. Sir, I write because I'm a setter of crossword puzzles. It was with considerable interest, therefore, and a good measure of incredulity, that I gradually spotted the fact the word Whittam crops up in anagrammatized form in each of the 5 stanzas of the poem. The occurrence of 5 such instances is surely way beyond the bounds of coincidence. Whittam, I learn, I'm not an Oxford man, is the name of some woods situated to the west of Oxford. If the verse tells us anything, then, it is surely that the body sought is to be found in Whittam Woods. Yours, Lionel Regis, 16 Cathedral Mews, Salisbury. Strange looked out across the car park. "Lionel Regis, my arse," he said quietly. On Wednesday, the 15th of July, at a slightly frosty meeting held in the Assistant Chief Constable's office at 10:30 a.m., the Swedish Maiden case was reviewed in considerable detail by the ACC himself, Chief Superintendent Strange, and Detective Chief Inspectors Johnson and Morse. The decision was reported, emanating from higher authority, that Morse was now IC. Amongst the items reviewed was yet another letter, printed that morning in the Times. From Mr. John C. Chavas. Sir, the wood, singular, not plural, please, at Whittam is a place most familiar to me. In lines 14 and 15 of the now notorious verses, we find a creation white, sick, trapped in a gin, sick, panting like a hunted deer, sick. Now, if this is not a cryptic reference to a gin and whatnot in that splendid old hostelry in Whittam, the White Hart, then I'm a Dutchman, sir. But I'm convinced, as an Englishman, that such a reference can only serve to corroborate the brilliant analysis of the verses made by Mr. Lionel Regis, letters July 13th. Yours faithfully, John C. Chavas, 21 Hayward Road, Bishop Auckland. Morse pointed lovingly to the White Hart Inn at Whittam the next morning as Lewis drove the pair of them to their meeting with the head forester. In a large clearing was set a whole complex of sheds and barns. From the furthest shed a figure with a dog walked down the slope to greet them. A man of about 50 or so, blue-eyed, closely bearded, and a little short of 6 foot, introducing himself as David Michaels, the head forester. They shook hands with the man. In the forester's hut, Michaels briefly described the layout of the woods, plural, referring to the 4 ordnance survey maps on the inner wall. There was a university committee, the policeman learnt, administering Whittam Woods, to whom he, Michaels, was personally responsible. Michaels expanded on the wood's main attractions. Duck Pond, the Follies, Bowling Alley, Cowley's Copse, Froghole Cottage, Hatchet Lane, Marley Wood, Pastics, Singing Way, Sparrow Lane, and to Morse these names sounded almost like the music of the woods and birds themselves. But as he watched and listened, Morse's heart was sinking slightly lower. The woodlands were vast, gratefully accepted the forester's offer of a guided tour. "You know, I'm beginning to think it'd take an army a couple of months to cover all this," said Morse inside the Land Rover. Patiently the forester explained how, during the summer months, there were dozens of devotees who regularly checked the numbers of eggs and weights of fledglings in the hundreds of bird boxes there, who laid nocturnal wait to observe the doings of the badgers. Then there were members of the public who were forever wandering around with their birdwatcher's guides and their binoculars. Morse was nodding automatically. "You mean there's a good deal of ground we can probably forget?" "That's it. And a good deal you can't." 2 hours later, back in the hut, Morse explained the limitation of his likely resources. "What I'd really like to know is this. Please don't feel offended, Mr. Michaels. But if you wanted to hide a body in these woods, which places would come to mind first?" So Michaels told them, and Lewis made notes. When, 20 minutes later, the trio walked down towards the police car, they heard a sharp crack of a gun. one of the farmers," explained Michaels. "I didn't see any guns in your office," commented Lewis. "Oh, I couldn't keep 'em there. Against the law, that is, Sergeant. But I suppose you must have one in your job, sir." "Oh, yeah. Couldn't do without it. In a steel cabinet in there." Michaels pointed to the low cottage. "Well and truly locked away, believe me. In fact, I'm off to do a bit of shooting now." "Off to preserve and maintain some of the local species, Mr. Michaels?" Michaels replied coolly. "Sometimes, quite often, it's essential to keep some sort of stability with any ecosystem." Morse jumped in quickly. "Sorry, I really am. It's just that as I get older, I can't really think of killing things. These days, I don't know why, I almost feel guilty about swatting a daddy longlegs." "You wouldn't find me killing a daddy longlegs," said Michael. And for a few seconds Morse wondered what exactly Michaels would kill, would be killing now. On Friday the 17th of July, Constable Jimmy Watt and his colleague, Constable Sid Berridge, halted for a while, in the riding between Marleywood on their right and Pastix on their left. 17 of them there were, working reasonably scientifically through this particular stretch. It had been an hour earlier, at 8:30 a.m., that a member of the Whittam Trust had addressed their party and explained why Pastix could be a reasonably safe each-way bet for a site where a body may have lain undisturbed for a longish time. The trees there allowed in very little light, and in the middle of it all there were 3 or 4 old spinneys that had existed even before the Enclosure Acts. Dense places. Double dense. It was a good many hours later, at 3:55 p.m., that the deeply and progressively more pessimistic pair of constables heard a shout of triumph on their left. A body had been found, and very soon each wing of the search party had enfolded the scene. A femur still lay in its approximately normal relationship to its pelvis, a shoulder bone in a vaguely formal relationship with the vertebrae, and the vertebrae themselves about 2 or 3 feet separated from a comparatively small and badly savaged skull, not far from which was a faded, tasselled neck scarf, still boasting its original colours, the twin, proud colours of the Swedish national flag. Morse had arrived on the scene within 20 minutes, and now stood there silently, his eyes recording the evidence before him. But neither Morse nor Lewis would be of much use at this stage. It was Max who was going to be the important personage. Max, the pathologist, who now made his lumbering progress across the crackling bracken and stood wheezing heavily beside Morse. He surveyed the sorry sight. From the look of it, the clothes were slightly better preserved than the body, and some yellowish, straw-coloured hair still gruesomely attached to the skull. "Is what you been looking for, Morse?" "Yes, I think that's her." "Her?" "I'm certain it's a her," said Morse with finality. Suddenly his eyes glowed as if some inner current had been activated. "I knew she'd be here, Max," he said slowly. "Somehow, I knew it." On the following morning, Saturday the 18th of July, Morse appeared, as Lewis saw things, somewhat distanced, somewhat reserved. "Where do we start?" asked Lewis. "Difficult. We ought really to wait until we hear from Max." "When's the report due? Tonight?" Morse shrugged. "There are several people we've got to see pretty soon. Number one, there's this fellow who found the rucksack, Daly. I never did like the sound of him." "You never met him, did you?" "Number two, there's the YWCA woman who spoke with Karen before she left for Oxford. She sounds nice. But you never I spoke to her on the phone, Lewis, if you must know. She sounds nice, that's all I said." "Number three," resumed Morse, "we must have a long session with that Whittam fellow, the Lone Ranger." "Did you like him?" Morse considered his inky fingers. He virtually told us where she was, didn't he? Told us where he would hide a body if he had to. Not likely to have told us if he'd put her there himself, though, surely. Self-incrimination, that. Morse said nothing. And there's the mother in Uppsala. Stockholm now. I suppose you'd be going there yourself, to Stockholm, I mean. Morse looked up, apparently with some surprise. Or you, Lewis? Or you? Very kind of you, sir. Now, I just wonder whether Mr. George Daly's still working on the Blenheim estate. Saturday, though. More likely to be off today. Yes. And his son Philip, was it? The lad who had a short-term birthday present of a camera? Karen Ericsson's camera? Probably still at school. No. The state schools in Oxfordshire broke up yesterday, the 17th. How did you know that? I rang up and found out. That's how. As Lewis drove out along the A44 to Begbrook, Morse took out a single handwritten sheet of A4 and read it. Not, in fact, for the first or even the fourth time. Dear Chief Inspector, thank you very much for your letter and for your interesting choice of records. Let me tell you what you want to know. I was married in 76, divorced in 82, remarried in 84 and separated in 88. One child, a daughter, now aged 20. Work that out, clever clogs. As you know, I consort fairly regularly with a married man from Oxford, and at less frequent intervals with others. So there. And you come along, and I hate you for it, because you're monopolizing all my thoughts. I reckon I've got some idea how that young girl who monopolizes your thoughts may have come by a bit of cash. Same way I did. Dare I send a little of my love? See. George Daly, on overtime, was planting out flowers in the Blenheim Garden Centre. Mr. Daly, Chief Inspector Morse, and this is Sergeant Lewis. Daly nodded. He was a man in his mid-40s, wearing a shabby khaki-green pork-pie hat. It's that thing I found, I suppose. Those things, yes, said Morse carefully. I can only tell you the same as I told him at the time. I'd just like you to read your statement through again, said Morse. No rush. It's often the little things, you know, that make all the difference. Are you in this evening, Mr. Daly? What, Saturday? If I called at your house about, 7? Where to now, sir? Queried Lewis. I reckon we'll just call round and see Mrs. Daly. What do you make of Mister? A little bit nervous. The woman who opened the door of number 2 Blenheim Villas showed no surprise. Margaret Daly appeared on first impressions a decided cut or two above her horticultural spouse. Morse apologized for disturbing her, and explained why they'd called and would be calling again, one of them certainly, at 7 o'clock that evening. It was you, Mrs. Daly, wasn't it, who got your husband to hand the rucksack in? Yes, but he'd have done it himself anyway. Morse walked over to a shelf above the electric fire and carefully picked up the figure of a small dog. King Charles? Margaret Daly nodded. Cavalier King Charles. We had one till last February, Mycroft. We all loved him. But Morse's attention appeared to have drifted far from dogs as he gazed through the French windows towards the back of the garden. I don't believe it, said Morse. Isn't that Asphodylina lutea? There, pointed Morse, those yellow things just across the fence. Buttercups, said Lewis. You've not got a pair of binoculars handy, Mrs. Daly? No, we haven't, I'm afraid. Mind if we had a look? Asked Morse. The three of them walked outside. Morse cursorily inspected the yellow flowers he had spotted earlier, and which he now agreed to be nothing rarer than buttercups. Mrs. Daly smiled vaguely at Lewis. "No compost heap?" asked Morse. "No." "Well, how do you get rid of your rubbish, then?" "Sometimes we go down to the waste disposal with it. We used to burn it, but a couple of years ago we upset the neighbours." It was Lewis, as they were leaving, who spotted the rifle amid the umbrellas in a stand just behind the front door. "Does your husband do a bit of shooting?" "Oh, that! George, occasionally, yes." "Ought to be under lock and key, that," said Lewis gently. "Perhaps you'd remind your husband, Mrs. Daly." Mrs. Julie Ireson, careers mistress at the Charles School, took Lewis up to her first-floor study. A buff-coloured folder containing the achievements of Philip Daly was on the table ready for him. Non-achievements, rather. He was now 17 years old and had officially just left school. Among other documents in the folder was a sheet on which 18 months previously, in his own handwriting, Philip had filled in a questionnaire about his 6 main leisure interests or pastimes in order of preference. The list read thus: 1. Football. 2. Pop music. 3. Photography. 4. Pets. 5. Motorbikes. 6. TV. "You can spell okay," commented Lewis. "Difficult to misspell pets, Sergeant." "Yeah, but, well, photography. Probably had to look it up in a dictionary." "You didn't like him," said Lewis slowly. "No, I'm afraid I didn't." "Any particular reason you want to know about him?" "No, just general, really," echoed Lewis. "If I could take the folder." In the lounge, in a less than convivial atmosphere, the Dalys sat side by side on the settee, and Morse from the armchair opposite got down to business. "You've managed to go through the statement again, Mr. Daly?" "Well, like I said, there's nothing as I can add." "Let me be honest with you, sir," said Morse. "It's this camera business that's worrying me." "What about it?" "You interested in photography yourself?" "Me? Not much, no." "Your son Philip is, though." "Yeah, well, he's got fairly interested in it recently, hasn't he, love?" Daly turned to his wife. "Bit more than that," Morse suggested. "You put it down on his list of hobbies at school last year, a few months before you found the camera. You've never had a camera yourself, you say?" "Correct." "How did you know the film in the camera was finished, then?" "Well, you know, it's the numbers, isn't it?" "Well, when it reads 10, you mean?" "Something like that." "What if there are 12 exposures on the reel?" "Dunno. Probably Philip has said so. Was his 10 or 12, love? Do you remember?" Morse pounced on the answer. "So he had a camera before?" "Yeah, well, just an old cheapo thing, we bought it." "Would you know how to get the film out of a camera, Mr. Daly?" "Well, not unless, you know." "But it says here," Morse looked down at the statement again, "it says here that you burnt the film." "Yeah, well, that's right, isn't it, love? We should have kept it, I know." "Where did you burn it?" asked Morse quietly. "Dunno, don't remember, just chucked it on the fire, I suppose." "That's electric," said Morse, pointing to the fireplace. "Yeah, and we got a grate for a coal fire next door, all right." "Did you have a fire that day?" "How the hell am I supposed to remember that? Did you know that the temperature in Oxfordshire that day was 74 degrees Fahrenheit? Well, at 10 o'clock at night?" Clearly Daly was losing his composure. "What did you burn in the garden?" "What do I burn? What do I burn? I burn bloody twigs and leaves, and you haven't got any trees. And July's a bit early for leaves." They sat silently, the Dalys neither looking at each other. "Was it you who got the film developed, Mr. Daly, or was it your son?" Morse's voice was quiet once more. "It was Philip," said Margaret Daly, finally now assuming control. "You must tell me what those photographs were," said Morse urgently.
Oh, there were only 6 or 7 out of the 12 that came out. There was some photos of birds, and there was 2 of a man, youngish man, probably her boyfriend.
I must have them, said Morse, simply, inexorably almost.
Well, he's chucked them out, surely, observed Daly.
Where is your son?
Gone into Oxford, I should think, Saturday night.
Take me to his room, will you?
Well, he bloody won't, growled Daly. But Mrs. Daly rose to her feet. If Philip has kept them photos, I reckon I might just know. Morse heard her on the stairs, his heart knocking against his ribs. Please, please, please. She returned some minutes later, holding 7 coloured prints, which she handed to Morse wordlessly. Thank you. No others? She shook her head. Why the hell didn't you tell me about them photos? Said Daly when Morse had gone. Shut up and listen, will you? If you must know, I've been looking in his room lately, George Daly. There were 12 photos, 5 of the girl. You stupid bitch! Listen! She shrieked. I never gave him them. I've hidden them. And now I'm going to get rid of them, and I'm not going to show them to you. Daly walked tight-lipped to the door. Stop moaning, you miserable bitch. His wife had taken a large pair of kitchen scissors from a drawer. Don't you ever talk to me like that again, George Daly. Her voice was trembling with fury. A few minutes after hearing the front door slam behind him, she went upstairs to their bedroom and took the 5 photographs out of her underwear drawer. All of them were of Karen Eriksson, nakedly or semi-nakedly lying in lewdly provocative postures. She took the 5 photographs to the loo, where standing over the pan she sliced strip after strip from the face, the breasts and the legs of the beautiful Karen Eriksson, intermittently flushing the celluloid slivers down into the Begbrook sewers. The ambulance, its blue light flashing, its siren wailing, finally pulled into the casualty bay of the John Radcliffe II hospital at 9:15 p.m. A series of hurried readings of electrocardiograph, blood pressure, chest x-ray, soon confirmed the fairly obvious: a massive coronary thrombosis, so very nearly an immediately fatal one. "Quite a well-known man, isn't he?" said a pretty nurse to the houseman. "Taught me as a student. Well, I went to his lectures. Blood, that was his speciality, really. Police get him all the time, post-mortems, that sort of thing." After the houseman had left, Nurse Shellick remained beside the sick man's bed. She was suddenly aware that his eyes had opened. "Nurse, I can hear you, yes? Will you get in touch with someone for me?" Of course, of course." She bent her right ear towards him. "Pardon?" "Morse." "I'm sorry, please say it again. I'm not quite sure." "Morse." The time was 11:15 p.m. The head forester's beautiful young wife was also in bed at this time. Her husband, David Michaels, turned his body towards her, and his right hand reached gently across her and fondled her breast. But she moved it from her. "No, not tonight." "Is something wrong?" "Why did you have to tell them?" she asked fiercely. "Because I know the bloody place better than anyone else, that's why." "But don't you realize? I had to tell them something. God, don't you see that? I didn't know, did I?" She sat up in bed and leaned towards him. "But they'll think you did it, David. Don't be so stupid. I wouldn't be giving them information if it was me. Can't you see that?" Seemingly, Kathy Michaels had accepted the logic of his words, and her mind was more at ease, for she now lay down again and turned towards him. As he considered the photographs, it was the man himself, pictured in 2 of them, who monopolized Morse's interest. A small to medium-sized man, in his late 20s perhaps, with longish fair hair, a man wearing a white T-shirt and faded blue denims. The man had been photographed at an oblique angle across the garden, with a house clearly shown to the left of the figure. A 3-story, rosy-bricked house with a French window on the ground floor, slightly ajar, with another window immediately above it, and one above that, all painted white, and with a black drain-pipe reaching down to ground level. And to the figure's right, a smallish tree of some sort with large curly leaves. The roof line of the house stretched away in a slightly convex curve as it appeared above the man's head, and then was cut off in the middle of the top of the photograph, but not before suggesting that the house could be one of a terrace, perhaps? So what then? Morse shook his head. Suddenly, an exciting thought occurred to him. The fact that the roof line of the terraced houses which formed the backdrop here might look as if it was curving in a convex fashion could be for one supremely simple and wholly adequate reason. It was curving. Could it be? Did Morse, even now, think he knew where it was? He felt the old familiar tingle across his shoulders. He rose from his armchair and went over to his bookshelves, whence he Penguin Oxfordshire in the Buildings of England series. He traced Park Town in the index, page 320, on which page he read, "Laid out in 1853-5, this was North Oxford's first development. The trust created for its developments promised elegant villas and terraces. What it became is this: 2 crescents," the blood tingled again, "north and south of an elliptical central garden, and bricked at the rear, leading on to small walled gardens." Phew, ye gods! If he was so disposed, Morse knew he could go and identify the house at that very moment. It must be in Crescent South. The sunshine would rule out Crescent North. As he sat down again in the black leather settee, Morse's face was betraying a high degree of self-gratification when the phone rang. It was now 1:15 p.m. She identified herself as Dr. Laura Hobson, one of Max's protégés. She'd been working late with Max on Morse's bones, when just before 9 p.m. she'd found him lying there on the floor of the lab. Severe heart attack. The sister at the hospital had rung her, Dr. Hobson, and the possibility was that he, Max, had been trying to ask for him, Morse. Oh dear. Which ward is he in? Coronary care unit. Yes, but where? The JR2. He'd been working on the bones all day, and bugger the bones. But please, forgive me if I hang up. You see, suddenly Morse's voice was more controlled, more gentle. Max and I, let's say we don't either of us have too many friends, and I want to see the old sod again if he's going to die. One patient, newly admitted to the JR2, had not rallied that night. Marion Bridewell, an 8-year-old little West Indian girl, had been knocked down by a stolen car on the Broadmoor Lee estate at 7 o'clock that evening. She had been terribly badly injured. She died just after midnight. "How are you, old friend?" asked Morse with spurious cheerfulness. "Dying. You once told me that we're all moving towards death, at the standard rate of 24 hours per diem. I was always accurate, Morse. You've still not told me Somebody said, nothing matters very much. In the end, nothing really matters at all. Lord Balfour. You always were a knowledgeable sod. The bones, Morse. What about the bones? You surprised, Morse? Pardon? You were, weren't you? Admit it. Surprised? The bones. Not a woman's bones, were they? Morse felt his heart pounding insistently somewhere. Not a woman's bones. Is that what Max had just said? Morse turned to find Nurse Shellick standing behind him. Please, her lips mouthed. But before he left, Morse leaned forward and whispered in the dying man's ear, "Keep a hold on things, Max. Please, keep a hold on things, just for me." But the police surgeon seemed to be asleep. Maximilian Theodore Siegfried de Bryn,
surrendered to an almost totally welcome weariness just after 3 o'clock that morning, 2 hours after Morse had left. Many were to feel a fleeting sadness at his death, but there was only one man who had wept silently when the call had been received. On Sunday, Dr. Laura Hobson told Morse of the simple yet quite extraordinary findings. The report on which Max had been working, though incomplete, was incontestable. The bones discovered in Witham Woods were those of an adult male, Caucasian, about 5 foot 6 inches in height, slimly built, fair-haired. But Morse's mind had already leapt many furlongs ahead of the field. He'd been sure that the bones had been those of Karen Eriksson. All right, he'd been wrong, but now he knew whose bones they were, for the face of the man in the photograph was staring back at him unmistakably. He took the report and rose to go. "You knew him well, didn't you?" she remarked. Morse nodded. "I feel so sad," said Dr. Hobson simply. Morse nodded again. "The cart is shaken all to pieces, and the rugged road is at its end." An urgent meeting of senior police officers had been summoned for 11 a.m. The police were continually finding themselves hamstrung by the refusal of the local inhabitants of Broadmorley Estate to name names and cooperate in clearing up the crime-ridden neighbourhood. But the death of Marion Bidwell, aged 8, had changed all that. The following day, Morse drove down a lane to Parktown. It was all childishly easy. After only a couple of minutes, he found himself leaning over the curved coping stones of the westernmost property, and finding the details on his photographs so easily matchable here. He felt thrillingly certain that it was in this garden that someone, probably Karen Eriksson, had taken the 2 photographs of the young man. He walked to the imposing front door of the end property designated Seckham Villa and rang the ground-floor bell. Dr. Alistair McBride. The door was opened by a tallish, heavily bearded man in his mid-30s, who studied Morse's authorization cautiously. He was over from Australia, he said, with his wife. They'd been in the flat since the previous August, and would be returning home in 2 weeks' time. "Did you know the people? Did you meet the people who were here before you?" "Right not," said the Australian. "Can I have a quick look inside?" Rather unenthusiastically, as it seemed, McBride led the way into the lounge. Looking out through the French windows, Morse felt a frisson of excitement. A dark-haired little girl in a pink dress was swinging idly to and fro beneath the tree. "Your daughter, sir?" "Yeah. You got any kids yourself, Inspector?" Morse shook his head. "Just one more thing, sir. Have you got your book, you know, your rent book or whatever, handy?" McBride found his property payment book, the legend "Finders Keepers" on the cover. As the 2 men walked back towards the entrance, McBride knocked very gently on the door to his right and put his ear to the panel. "Darling? Darling?" But there was no reply. "Finders Keepers, that's the Banbury Road office, is it?" "Yeah. You off there now?" "I think I'll drop in straight away, yes." At Finders Keepers, Mr. Martin Buckby, the dark, smartly suited manager of property letting services, would be only too glad to help. When he'd finished explaining the letting procedure, Morse wondered if it were proper for him to ask, for example, what Dr. McBride was paying for the ground-floor flat at Seckham Villa. £1,300 per month. Phew, bit steep, isn't it? It's a going rate. It's a lovely flat, isn't it? Well, that was the manager's job, wasn't it? To make the most of what Morse had seen with his own eyes as a pretty limited bit of Lebensraum, especially for a married couple with 1 infant. At least 1 infant. "Didn't you just say that the maximum for a short-term let was £200 a week?" Buckby grinned. "Yeah, not for that place. Well, you've seen it. And what makes you think it's a short-term let, Inspector?" The blood was tingling at the back of Morse's neck. He reached over and picked up the specification sheet. 2 bedrooms,
and a sick wife sleeping in one of them. Studio, and a little girl sitting on a swing. God! Morse shook his head in disbelief at his own idiocy. I really came to ask you, sir, if you had any record of who was living in that property last July, but I think you're going to tell me that it was Dr. Alistair McBride. That he hasn't got a wife, that the people upstairs have got a little dark-haired daughter, and the fella probably hails from Malta. Yeah, Gibraltar, actually. You've got some spare keys, sir? Asked Morse, almost despairingly. Lewis arrived at Second Villa at 2:15 that afternoon. Morse briefly brought Lewis up to date with his discovery of the garden, where in all probability Karen Eriksson had spent some period of time before she disappeared, and his gullibility in allowing McBride, fairly certainly now a key figure in the drama, more than sufficient time to effect a hurried escape. Inside the basement of Second Villa, through an archway, a large living area was found furnished with armchairs, TV, hi-fi equipment, and a double bed of mahogany, stripped down to a mattress of pale blue. And beside the bed, a jointed series of square wooden boards, 4 of them, along which, for the length of about 10 feet, ran 2 steel rails. Rails where, it was immediately assumed, a cine camera had recently and probably frequently been moving to and fro. Naturally, it was this trackway beside the basement double bed which attracted the most interest. Much lifting of eyebrows and many lascivious asides amongst those investigators whose powers of detection, at least in this instance, were the equal of the chief inspector's. Indeed, it would have required a man of monumental mutton-headedness not to visualize before him the camera and the microphone moving slowly alongside the mattress to record the assorted feats of fornication enacted on that creaking charpoy. It was Lewis who found the photographs folded away inside a newspaper, The Star. There were 14 A4 sheets. On each sheet, several photographs of the same girl were figured in various stages of undress, and at the bottom of each sheet there appeared a Christian name, followed by personal details. In almost every case, the bottom left-hand picture was of the model completely naked, and in 3 or 4 cases striking some sexually suggestive pose. The names were of the glitzy showgirl variety: Jane, Kelly, Lindy Lou, Mandy, and most of them appeared to be in their 20s. But 4 of the sheets depicted older women: Elaine, Dorothy, Mary, Louisa. The only other information given was of priority services. Not much to trouble the law there. 3 of the younger girls, though, were far more explicit about their specialisms, with Mandy listing home videos and pornographic movies. And then, as Morse and Lewis were considering these things, the big discovery was made. A DC who had been searching the main lounge above had found, caught up against the top of one of the drawers in the escritoire, a list of names and addresses, a list of clients, surely. Clients who probably received their pornographic material in plain brown envelopes with the flat licked down so very firmly. And there, 4th from the top, was the name that both Morse and Lewis focused on immediately. George Daly, 2 Blenheim Villas, Begbrook, Oxon. Morse had been delighted with the find. Of course he had. Yet now, as he sat on the settee, he appeared to Lewis to be preoccupied and rather sad. "Everything all right, sir?" "What?" "Oh, yes, fine." He looked again at the 17th name on the list. He was never likely to forget the name that Kidlington HQ had given him when, from Lyme Regis, he'd phoned in a car registration H35 LWL. Dr. Alan Harding. He picked up the pictures of the models again. Especially did he look again at one of the maturer models, the one who called herself Louisa, the one who'd had all sorts of fun with her names at the Bay Hotel in Lyme Regis, the woman who was photographed here, quite naked and totally desirable, Claire Osborne. Picking up his sheet, Morse decided that his presence in Second Villa was no longer required. He returned to HQ, where he tried her telephone number. She was in. "Claire?" "Morse!" She'd recognized him. You could have told me you worked for an escort agency. Why? Morse couldn't think of an answer. Why don't you get yourself in your car and come over tonight? I'd be happy if you did. Morse sighed deeply. You told me you had a daughter. So? Do you still keep in touch with the father? Father? Christ, come off it. I couldn't tell you who the father was. Morse's heart was suddenly rent in twain, and asking her for the name and address of the modelling agency, which she refused to tell him, he rang off. 10 minutes later, the phone went on Morse's desk, and it was Claire. You silly bugger. You can't see more than 2 inches in front of your nose, can you? Don't you realise I'd have swapped all the lecherous sods I've ever had for you? Look, Claire. No, you bloody look. If you can't take what a woman tells you about herself without picking over the past, asking bloody futile questions, Claire... But the line was dead.
The entrance hall of the flats was of polished pink granite, with the long list of tenants' name displayed there. 6B. 6th floor. The door, bearing the nameplate Eriksson, was opened by a woman in her mid-40s. Mrs. Eriksson? Irma Eriksson, she insisted, as he shook her hand and entered the apartment. In here, Mr. Lewis. She smiled and led the way. Conversation was easy. No, there was nothing she could add. From that day to this, Irma Eriksson had received no further news of her daughter. None. At first, she couldn't bring herself to believe that Karen was dead, but gradually she had been forced to such a conclusion. Can I get you coffee? A little Swedish schnapps, yes? When she went out to the kitchen, Lewis stood up and walked slowly around the room, staring long at some of the photographs, and especially at one of them, at 3 young ladies standing arm in arm, dressed in Swedish national costume. Ah, I see you found my beautiful daughters. She had moved in silently. Katarina, Karen, Christina. She pointed to each in turn. Lewis held the framed photograph. So much alike, the 3 of them, each with long, straight, gold-blonde hair. Mama then unexpectedly took the photograph from Lewis's hands and replaced it. How can I help you any more? She asked. So Lewis asked her a lot of questions, and was soon to be forming a much clearer picture of the daughter, about whom her mother spoke so lovingly now. Another schnapps? Why not? Said Mr. Lewis. Katarina, Irma Eriksson resumed, the eldest daughter, should it be elder now, though, was married and working with the European Commission in Strasbourg as an interpreter. The youngest, younger daughter, Christina, still only 18, was in her last year of schooling. She was living at home there in the flat. Lewis turned the conversation back to Karen. What was Karen like as a person? Well, her mother supposed she would call her independent. The summer before she'd gone to England, she'd spent 2 months on a kibbutz near Tel Aviv. She was never an easy young girl. She was never the sort of girl who went to bed, you know. She was fond of bird-watching, he said. Oh, yes. Never did she go out on any holiday or walk without taking the binoculars. There was just the one thing left now which Morse had asked him to confirm. The passport and the work permit procedures for a young lady like Karen. No problem. Karen had not applied for a work permit. She gave herself only 3 weeks in the UK. And for this, her Swedish passport, valid for a 10-year period, would have been sufficient. You kept Karen's passport, didn't you? The woman continued quietly. Lewis nodded. You've been very helpful, he said. Just one more thing. If I could just borrow a photo of the 3 girls. Standing on her high balcony, Irma Eriksson watched him go. Then she stepped back into her flat and let herself into the rear bedroom, where the ensuing conversation was held in Swedish. Was he intelligent? Not particularly. Very nice, though. Very nice. You think he suspected anything? No. Shall I get you coffee? Please. When her mother had left, the young lady looked at herself in the long wall mirror, deciding that she was looking tired. Yet had Lewis seen her there that afternoon, he would have been impressed by her pale and elegant beauty.
would have been struck immediately, too, by a very close likeness to the photograph of the student found in the rucksack at Begbroke, Oxfordshire. Alan Harding had not been wholly surprised to receive the phone call from Chief Inspector Morse that morning of Tuesday the 21st of July, and a meeting was arranged for 2 p.m. the same day in Harding's rooms, overlooking the front quad of Lonsdale College. "What does your wife know about your interest in Seckham Villa?" "Oh, nothing. Absolutely nothing. So please, can we keep Lynn, my wife, out of this? She's still terribly upset and nervy." Dr. Harding was a smallish, neat man with crinkly grey hair. "Know this man?" Morse handed across one of the photographs taken in the garden of Seckham Villa. Harding glanced for only a second or two at the photograph. "James, or Jamie Myton. Yes, I know him. Knew him." "How did you get to know him?" "Look, it'll be better if I tell you about myself. I think it will." Morse listened with interest and with no moral reproof, as Harding stated his apologia for a lifetime of sexual adventurism. After his marriage, he had experienced a yearning for ever greater variety in his sexual gratification, and this had gradually resulted in a string of rather sordid associations, with private film clubs, imported videos and magazines, live sex shows, hostess parties. "And that's what happened regularly at Seckham Villa?" "Very regularly. Seldom more than 5 or 6 of us." Morse felt he should have despised the man a little. But he couldn't do that. If Harding were a bit of a pervert, he was an extraordinarily honest one. "And you first met Claire Osborne at Seckham Villa?" "She told you that was her name?" "Louisa Harding, too." Harding smiled sadly. "Her one and only tribute to me." "No, she never went to Seckham Villa herself, as far as I know," he went on. "I met her through an agency. Through McBride. You'll have to give me the address of the agency." "I suppose so." "How do you manage to get all this stuff without your wife knowing?" "Plain envelopes, parcels, here to my rooms. No problem." "No problem," repeated Morse quietly, with some distaste in his voice at last. Harding watched from his window as the Chief Inspector walked away. If he'd been a little brighter, perhaps he would have asked 1 or 2 more perceptive questions about the lecherous cameraman Myton. Yet, oddly enough, the Chief Inspector had seemed considerably more interested in Claire Osborne than in the most odious man it had ever been his, Harding's, misfortune to encounter. That afternoon, P.C. Pollard was completely pissed off with life. He'd spoken to no one for more than 2 hours since the 2 fellows from the Path Lab had been along to examine the cordoned-off area. A police car was promised up along the Singing Way at 5 p.m. 4:55 p.m. Pollard folded away his copy of The Sun and walked slowly through the woodland riding. A pair of eyes was watching him. The eyes of a man who made no movement until the woodland around was completely still again. The man made his way into the area behind the cordoned square, and leaning forward, his eyes constantly fixed on the ground, began to tread slowly, for about 20 yards or so, before turning and retracing his steps along a line 4 or 5 feet further into the forest, repeating this process again and again until he had covered an area of roughly 15 yards square. It was just after 6 p.m. when he found it. Almost had he missed it, just the top of the black handle showing. His eyes gleamed with elation. It was 5 p.m. before Morse pulled into the parking area of the elite booking services in Abingdon Road. There were 2 women proprietors, one very large and certainly ill-advised to be wearing a pair of wide crimson culottes, and the other rather small and minimally skirted. Instinctively Morse felt that the latter, if either, would be the boss, but it was the large woman in her late 20s who spoke first. "This is Selina, my assistant. I'm Michelle Thompson. How can I help you?" The agency was the receptor, the collator, and the distributor of information from all quarters of the country, interest and use to assorted businesses, ranging from TV companies to film producers, magazine editors to, well, all right, purveyors of rather less salubrious products. McBride had been a client for about 2 years. A very good client, if full and prompt payment were the criterion. 80% of the negotiated fee to the model, 20% to the agency. The link with the YWCA in London was very simple. The woman the police had earlier interviewed, Mrs. Audrey Morris, was her sister. On the Friday before Karen had hitchhiked to Oxford, Audrey had phoned to say that they had a young Swedish student with them who was down to her last few pennies. That Audrey had written out the name, address, and telephone number of the elite agency, and assured Michelle that the young lady was shapely, very photogenic, and probably sufficiently worldly wise to know that a suitable session with a photographer might well work wonders for an impoverished pocket. And she came. She rang us from a call box in Wentworth Road in North Oxford, and Selina went up in the Mini to fetch her. Selina had brought her there to Abingdon Road, attractive, bronzed, blonde, full-figured, skimpily dressed, with a rucksack. The client from Second Villa had been on the lookout for such and similar offerings. A phone call, a verbal agreement, £100 for an hour's session, £80 to the girl, 20 to the agency. How did she get up to Parktown? Dunno. And that was that, at least for the present. Lewis's report from Sweden had been far more interesting than Morse could have hoped. The flesh had been put on the bones, as it were. The thoughts of others, too, appeared to be shifting away from any guesswork concerning the likeliest spot in which to dig for the Swedish maiden, especially the thoughts behind the latest letter to the Times, which Morse read with considerable interest on the morning of Friday, the 31st of July. From the Reverend David M. Sturdy. Sir, like so many of your regular readers, I have been deeply impressed by the ingenuity expended by your correspondents on the now notorious Swedish maiden verses. Two things may strike the reader immediately. First, the archaisms, telst, knowest, whither, thy, thee, etc., which strongly suggest that the author is wholly steeped in the language of Holy Writ. Second, the regular resort to hymnological vocabulary. The day thou gavest, Lord, is ended, as pants the heart for cooling streams. May I be allowed, therefore, to put two and two together and make, not a murderer, but a minister of God's church? May I go even further, and suggest a minister in the Church of Rome, where the confessional is a commonplace, and where, in rare circumstances, a priest may be faced with a grievous dilemma. The circumstances say when a sinner confesses to an appalling crime, and when the priest may be tempted to compromise the sacred principle of confidentiality, and to warn society about a self-confessed psychopath. Might it not be worthwhile, then, for the Thames Valley CID to conduct some discreet inquiries among the RC clergy within, say, a 10-mile radius of Carfax? Yours truly, David M. Sturdy, St. Andrew's Vicarage, Norwich. On Broadmoor Lee, the erection of bollards and concrete blocks, the construction of humps across the streets, had put a virtual stop to any possibility of further joyriding. All a bit makeshift, but all quite effective. There was revulsion, too, at the young girl's death. Marion Bridewell had been knocked down by a car, a shiny new BMW stolen from High Wycombe, with 4 youths inside. A good many of the local inhabitants knew who one or two of them were, and some were now semi-willing to testify to names and incidents. 6 people had been charged already, and were still sitting in the cells. There would very soon be 4 more of them, the BMW 4. The following day, Saturday the 15th of July, Philip Daly had caught the bus into Oxford at 11 a.m., and his mother ventured quietly, fearfully into his bedroom with the Hoover. In his red pocket diary she read, "Another tonight. Wow, what a squealer, what a beaut. I've never been so excited before." And then the last entry a fortnight later. "Finish, end. We never meant it, none of us. The scream sounded just like the tyres, but we never meant it." The date was Saturday, 18th of July. Margaret Daly's heart sank with her, and in her misery she wished that she were dead. On Sunday, the 26th of July, at early Mass, the mind of Margaret Daly was agonizingly preoccupied. It had begun 2 years earlier, when George had bought the video. It was his toy. But in spite of his growing collection of tapes, George seldom actually watched them, or so Margaret had thought. Gradually, however, she'd begun to realize that he did watch them, when she was away from the house. It had been on Tuesday night when she'd left the aerobics class early and returned home to find her husband jumping up from his seat on the floor beside the TV screen and hurriedly flicking the stop switch on the video. The next day, when he was at work, she'd managed to get the wretched thing working and had witnessed a few minutes of wholly explicit and, to her, monstrously disgusting pornography. She'd said nothing, though. "The Mass is ended. Go in peace." "Thanks be to God," she'd replied, and waited in her place until only one other solitary soul lingered there, still kneeling. Father Richards re-entered the church, and as he did so, Margaret Daly rose and spoke earnestly to him, requesting a confessional hearing. He said gently, "If it will help my child, come now." For a while Father Richards offered no words of consolation. Finally he spoke. "You must talk to your son, my child, and you must feel able to forgive him. And you must pray to God for guidance and strength. I too will pray to God for you." "Oh, thank you, Father," she whispered. Margaret Daly walked out of the church to her car. Another person was standing there, probably waiting for a lift, it seemed. The person who had been kneeling in the church, a person who now turned and looked into Margaret's face, then looked past her, unrecognizing, and turned away. The look had lasted but a second, yet that second Margaret Daly's scalp had thrilled with sudden fear. On the morning of Monday, the 27th of July, Morse and Lewis were back in business at Kidlington HQ. Lewis, at Morse's insistence, once more going through his Swedish trip with meticulous detail, especially through the furnishings and the photographs on view in Irma Eriksson's living room. Morse considered once again Karen's list of hopefully soon-to-be-identified British birds, and realized that as yet he'd made no contact with the women who lived down near Llandovery, the home of the red kites. Llandovery, out into Wales along the A40. Morse had reread the statement made by Mrs. Dorothy Evans, in which she'd affirmed quite simply that Karen Eriksson had never visited her, never even telephoned her at that time. In fact, had not seen little Karen since that now largish girl was 10 years old. No. The solution to the murder lay there in Oxford. Morse was convinced of that. At 10:30 he decided that he had to speak to David Michaels once more, the man who had pointed the way almost literally so to the body found in Pastix, the man who knew the woodland ridings out at Whittam better than almost any man alive. As the police car drove up the lane that led into Whittam Woods, on the gatepost to the right was fixed a bold notice. Whittam Amateur Operatic Society presents The Mikado by Gilbert and Sullivan, July the 30th and 31st and August the 1st. Tickets £3.50. Morse seemed for a while almost half asleep as Lewis stopped the car and looked across at the stone cottage where Michaels lived. "Oh, we're in luck, sir." Lewis wound down his window and a rifle under his right arm. "Start the car up again, Lewis," said Morse very quietly. "Pardon?" "Back to the village," hissed Morse. They were almost the first customers in the White Hart, and Morse ordered a pint of best bitter for himself. "Which would you prefer, sir? We've got whatever the locals drink." But Morse had turned to Lewis. "You'd better have an orange juice. You're driving, remember?" At the time Lewis was lifting his first pint at the White Hart, Alistair McBride was standing beside reception at the Prince William Hotel in Spring Street, just opposite Paddington Railway Station. After leaving Oxford, he'd driven the swiftly, chaotically loaded van via the M40 up to London, where he'd parked it in a lock-up garage off the Seven Sisters Road before taking the tube and a suitcase to Paddington, to the Prince William. It gave him considerable confidence that he could, if necessary, be standing in front of the departure board of the mainline BR station within 1 minute of stepping outside his hotel. "So you see, old friend, you see?" Morse beamed hugely as he finished his second pint. "It was all due to you, again!" Lewis could see, for once, was able to see perfectly clearly, and this for him was the joy of working with a strange man called Morse. In her laboratory, Dr. Laura Hobson had now begun to write her report after resuming her analysis of the Whittam bones. Quite early on she'd spotted the slight groove on the lower left rib. It might have been the sharp incision of a rodent's tooth, of course, but it looked so distinctive, that thinly V-shaped mark. It was almost as if someone had deliberately made a notch on the rib with a knife or similar instrument. It might be important, and Laura was oddly anxious to ingratiate herself a little with the strange policeman who had monopolized her thoughts these last few days. If it were a knife that had been driven through the lower chest, it could well be, probably was, the cause of death. At 6:45 p.m. the first serious rehearsal was underway for the Mikado. 3 hours, his wife had said, about that. And David Michaels had been waiting outside the village hall since 9:30 p.m. It was now beginning to get really dark, and he was never going to take any chances with his lovely wife. His talented wife, too. She'd only been a member of the chorus line in the village revue the previous Christmas. But now, here she was as one of the 3 Japanese girls from school. Nice part. Easy to learn. She finally emerged at 10:10 p.m., and Michaels drove her immediately along to the White Hart. "Same as usual?" he asked, as she hitched herself up onto the bar stool. "Please." "It's going to be all right, is it?" he asked. "Is what going to be all right?" "What do you think I mean? The Mikado." "Hope so. You'll enjoy me anyway." Wednesday, the 29th of July, was promising to be a busy day, and so it proved. In mid-morning, Lewis rang the Oxford Mail and spoke to the editor. He'd like to fax some copy which Morse had earlier drafted for that evening's edition. It read, "New developments in Swedish maiden mystery. Detective Chief Inspector Morse of the Thames Valley CID is confident that recently unearthed evidence has thrown a completely new light on the baffling case of Karen Eriksson, who disappeared in Oxford more than a year ago. A body found after a search of Whittam Woods has proved not to be that of the Swedish student, and the Chief Inspector told our reporter that further searches of the area there have now been called off. Murder inquiries continue, however, and it is understood that the focus of police activity is now once again centred on the Blenheim estate in Woodstock, the scene of the first phase of intensive inquiries just over a year ago. The police are also asking anyone to come forward who has any information concerning Dr. Alistair McBride, until very recently living at Second Villa, Parktown, Oxford. Later in the day, both Chief Superintendent Strange and Chief Inspector Johnson were to read this article with considerable puzzlement. And someone else had read the article. The slim Selina at the agency had been almost certain, when Morse had asked for anything on McBride, that there had been a photograph somewhere. Later that afternoon in Abingdon Road, and temporarily minus the mighty Michelle, she decided where, if anywhere, the photograph might be. She looked in the files under parties, promotions, etc., and there it was. The bearded McBride, his arms around 2 female co-revellers. Morse's day was satisfactory, but little more. He arrived in good time at the Swedish Embassy in Montague Place for his meeting with Ingmar Engström, a slim, blond fellow in his 40s, who proved competent and helpful, and willing to instigate immediate inquiries into the matter which Morse, with the greatest care, explained to him. Morse could well have done without the large plastic cup of weak-looking lukewarm tea from the communal urn in the canteen of the YWCA premises. For a while they chatted amiably, if aimlessly, Morse discovering that Mrs. Audrey Morris, the superintendent, had married a Welshman, had just one sister, the one at the model agency in Oxford, and, well, that was that. Morse went through the main points of her earlier statement and sought answers to some other questions. Questions about what Karen was like, how she behaved, how she'd got on with the others there. His knowledge of Karen Eriksson was slowly growing all the time, was growing now as Mrs. Morris rather gently recalled a girl who was always going to catch men's eyes, who was certainly aware of her attraction. Morse stood up and prepared to leave, just as Karen Eriksson must have stood up to take her leave from these very premises, with only £10 in her purse, and the firm resolve, if Mrs. Morris could be believed, of hitchhiking her way not only to Oxford, but very much further out along the A40 to Llandovery, the home of the Red Kite. Morse arrived back in Oxford at 6:25 p.m, and as he crossed over the bridge from Platform 2, he found himself quietly humming one of the best-known songs from the Mikado. For several persons either closely or loosely connected with the Swedish maiden case, the evening of Thursday the 30th of July was of considerable importance. 7:25 p.m. One of the three little maids peered out from one side of the tatty, ill-running stage curtain and saw that the hall was already packed. Saw her husband David, bless him, there on the back row. He'd insisted on buying himself a ticket for each of the three performances. Yes, for Kathy Michaels the adrenaline was flowing freely, and any worries her husband might be harbouring for her, or she for him, were wholly forgotten as with the first few bars of the overture, the Mikado had begun. Quickly she looked again in one of the mirrors there, at the white-faced, black-haired, pillar-box, red-lipped Japanese lady who was herself, and knew why David found her so attractive. David. She loved him and would do anything for him. 7:50 p.m. The four youths, aged 12, 14, 17 and 17, were still being held in police custody at St Aldate's. Whereas collectively, on the East Oxford estates, they had by all accounts appeared a most intimidating bunch, individually they now looked unremarkable. "These things all you had on you, son?" said Sergeant Rawlinson. "Suppose so, yeah." Rawlinson picked the youth's belongings up carefully, one by one, and handed them across. "And this?" Rawlinson picked up a red-covered diary and put it in his own jacket pocket. "We're going to keep this, son. Now I want you to sign there." 10 minutes later, Philip Daly was once more in the back of a police car, heading out to his home in Begbrook, Oxford. Rawlinson hadn't recognised the lad, but he'd recognised the name immediately, from that time the previous summer when he'd been working under Chief Inspector Johnson, out at Blenheim. It could, of course, have just been coincidence, had it not been for the diary. A bit disturbing, some of the things written in that. 8:15 p.m. Anders Fasten, a very junior official at the Swedish Embassy, had at last found what he was looking for. It had been a long search, but he was pleased to have found it. It was important, he'd been informed. 9 p.m. Sergeant Lewis had arrived home from HQ half an hour earlier, had a meal of eggs, 2, sausages, 6, and chips, legion, and now sat back in his favourite chair and reviewed his day with considerable satisfaction. Especially, of course, had Morse been delighted with the photograph of Alistair McBride, and even more delighted with the fact that, on his own initiative, Lewis had given instructions for police leaflets to be printed, and for adverts to be placed in the following day's Oxford Mail, Friday's edition of the Oxford Times, and the Evening Standard. "Master stroke, that is," Morse had exclaimed. "What made you think of the Evening Standard?" "You said you were sure he'd gone to London, sir." "Ah!" "Didn't meet him by any chance?" Lewis had asked, happily. 10:30 p.m. In the White Horse, Dr. Alan Harding took out, too, the photograph of Claire Osborne from amongst his membership and credit cards. A small passport photograph. It was ridiculous going on with the affair, really. But how could he help himself? One other thing was worrying him that night. Had been worrying him increasingly since the visit of Chief Inspector Morse. He was fairly sure that before long he would be compelled to disclose the truth about what had occurred a year ago. 10:30 p.m. After watching the weather forecast, Claire Osborne turned off the ITN news at 10. She poured herself a gin and dry martini, and studied one of the typed sheets that Morse had sent her. Mozart, Requiem, K626. In 2 days' time she would have her 40th birthday, and she was going to buy a tape or a record of the Requiem. On Morse's list of recordings, Herbert von Karajan was the only one of the 5 conductors she'd heard of, and Deutsche Grammophon looked and sounded so impressive. Yes, she tried to get that one. Again she looked down at the sheet, trying to get the correct spelling of that awkward word Deutsche into her head, with its tricky T-S-C-H-E sequence. God almighty, she whispered to herself. Dr. Laura Hobson entered Morse's office the following morning just before 9 o'clock, where after being introduced to Sergeant Lewis, she took a seat and said her say. Her guess was that the man whose bones were found in Pastix was about 30 years of age, of medium height, had been dead for at least 9 or 10 months, might well have been murdered with a knife wound to the heart, and that perhaps delivered by a right-handed assailant. The body had most probably exited, Morse winced, on the spot where the bones were found, not likely to have been carried or dragged there after death. Later, in Johnson's small office, Morse learned of the red diary found the previous day on the person of Philip Daly. Johnson now stated his case. Daly Jr. had been one of the 4 youths, though not the driver, in the stolen BMW that had killed Marion Bridewell. Bit of an odd coincidence, certainly, the boy being involved in both cases, commented Morse. No, coincidences never worried you much, did they? Morse shrugged. I don't reckon he had much to do with the Erickson case, though. Except he had the camera, said Johnson slowly. Yes. Morse nodded and frowned. Something was troubling him a little, like a speck of grit in a smoothly oiled mechanism. It was immediately following Morse's almost unprecedentedly alcohol-free lunch that the crucial break in the case occurred, and it was Lewis's good fortune to convey the tidings to the canteen. When earlier in the week Morse had argued that a car would have been required, that a car would have to be disposed of, when earlier Morse had argued these points, the firing plugs in Lewis's practical mind had sputtered into life. Cars lost, cars stolen, cars vandalized, cars burned, cars abandoned. Lewis had straightway gauged the possibilities. After consultation with the traffic unit, he'd been able to set in motion a program of fairly simple checks, with attention focused on the few days following the very last sighting of Karen Erickson. Lieutenant Colonel Basil Villas, MC, had rung the police on no less than 12 occasions during the period concerned, complaining that a car found abandoned and vandalized, and thereafter further vandalized and finally fired, was a blot on the beautiful landscape. But it had only been after considerable difficulty that the owner of the vehicle had been traced, and the offending eyesore towed away from the neighbourhood of the Colonel's bungalow. The keying in of the registration number now, as presumably a year earlier, had produced within a few seconds the name and address of the owner, James Myton, of 24 Hickson Drive, Ealing, or rather, formerly of 24 Hickson Drive, Ealing, since immediate inquiries at this address had confirmed only that James Myton had not lived there for more than a year. By mid-afternoon, there was also firm corroboration from Ealing that the body found in Pastix was that of James William Myton. At the ticket office in the mainline Paddington terminus, McBride asked for a single to Oxford. The 6:20 was already standing at platform 9, but there were 10 minutes to spare, and from a British Telecom booth there, he rang a number, direct line, in Lonsdale College, Oxford. Dr. Harding put the phone down slowly. He supposed McBride would have caught up with him somewhere, sometime. He'd agreed to meet the man, of course. They would talk of many things, of what was to be done and what was not to be done, and then... Oh, God, what then? Life was becoming intolerable. The failure of his marriage, his rejection by the only woman he'd really grown to love, his pathetic addiction to pornography, the death of his daughter, and now, just a few minutes ago, the reminder of perhaps the most terrible thing of all. The second night of the Mikado was just about to start. With 5 minutes to go, she peeped through the curtain again and scanned the packed audience. She could see no David. He must, she thought, be standing just outside the hall, talking to somebody. But the seat K5 was destined to remain unoccupied that evening. Chief Inspector Morse appeared less than surprised when the telephone call came through from Dr. Alan Harding the following morning. Could he see Morse, please? When they met, Harding had readily agreed to have his statement recorded on tape. The later transcription read, "On Sunday, the 7th of July, 1991, I joined 4 other men in Seckham Villa, Parktown, Oxford. Those present were Alistair McBride, George Daly, David Michaels, James Myton, and myself. McBride informed us that we might be in for an interesting afternoon, since a young Swedish student would be coming to sit for what was euphemistically termed a photographic session. We learned that she was a beautiful girl and desperately in need of money. Myton, I'm ashamed to say, was the editor of a series of sex magazines, whose particular slants ranged from bestiality to paedophilia. In photography, however, Myton had the magical touch of the born artist. But things didn't work out. It soon transpired that the girl I now know to have been Karen Eriksson had misunderstood the nature of her engagement, that she was happy enough to do a series of nude stills with a camera, and with one cameraman. No, it was about half an hour later that we heard the awful commotion in the room immediately above us, and we followed McBride up the stairs. The young woman lay motionless there, with blood all over the white sheets. Fresh blood. Yet it was not her blood. It was Myton's. He sat there crumpled up on the floor, his eyes widely dilated with pain and fear. But for the moment, it was the naked girl who compelled our attention. There were horridly bright red marks around her throat. Very soon we knew that she was dead. I turned to see dark red blood suddenly spurting from Myton's mouth. 6 or 7 times his body heaved in mighty spasms, before he too lay still. Of the sequence of events which had led up to this double tragedy, it is impossible to be certain. What was clear to us all was that she'd stabbed Myton with a knife as she fought off his advances, but she still clutched the knife even then in her right hand. I now come to the most difficult part of my statement. Let me put it simply. We decided to cover up the whole ghastly tragedy. There could be no thought of the bodies being disposed of before the hours of darkness, and so it was agreed that the 4 of us should reassemble at Seckenvilla at 9:45 p.m. Myton's car was the biggest headache, but the enormous rise in the number of car-related crimes in Oxford that year suggested a reasonably simple solution. It was decided that I should drive his Honda out to the edge of Otmore at 10:45 p.m. that same night and vandalise it. McBride had followed me in his van, and indeed assisted me in my task before driving back to Oxford. But there was the other huge problem, the disposal of 2 bodies, and also the ditching somewhere of the girl's rucksack. The bodies were eventually loaded into the back of McBride's van, which drove off under the darkness of that night, first to Whittam Woods, where the 2 foresters transferred Myton's body to the Land Rover, and then drove out to dispose of the body in the heart of the woods somewhere. Then the same men drove out to Blenheim, where Daly, naturally, had easy access to any part of the great park, and where Karen Eriksson's weighted body was pushed into the lake. The statement was dated the 1st of the 8th, 1992, and signed by Dr. Alan Harding. Whilst Harding was still only halfway through this statement, George Daly was boxing some petunias in the walled garden at Blenheim Garden Centre. He felt the touch of a hand on his shoulder and jerked nervously. "Christ, you got here quick. You said it was urgent." "Now look." "No. You look. The police will have that statement sometime this morning. Probably got it already. And we've agreed, you've agreed, remember that." Daly took off his ever-present hat. "Not any longer. Look at this." Daly took a letter from his pocket. "Came in the post this morning, didn't it? That's why I rang. See what I could get done for? Me! Just for that bleeding twerp of mine. No, mate. What we agreed's no good no longer. We double it, or else no deal. 4, that's what I want. Not 2, 4. 4? Where the hell do you reckon that's coming from? It's your problem, innit? If I could find it," said the other slowly. "How do I know you're not going—" "You don't. It's trust, isn't it? We can't get anything, you know that. Not till the bank opens Monday." There was silence between them. "You won't regret it, mate," said Daly finally. "I'll bloody kill you, Daly, if you try it on again." There was a menace now in his quiet voice, and he turned to go. "Better if you come to me. Fewer people about. Don't mind? About 10, in my office." "What do you make of things?" said Morse, after Harding had left. "Well, 1 or 2 things a bit odd, sir," said Lewis. "Only 1 or 2? "Well, there's 2 things, really. I mean, there's this fella Daly, isn't there? He shoves the girl's body into the lake at Blenheim." "Yes." "Well, he leaves the girl's rucksack in a hedge bottom at Begbrook. I mean—" "I wish you'd stop saying 'I mean,' Lewis." "Well, you'd think he'd have left it miles away, wouldn't you?" You just said 2 things, didn't you? Yeah. They decided to put Michael's body in Whittam Woods, agreed? What I can't understand is why Michael's told you where it was. I mean... Sorry, sir. But he didn't, did he? He told you about Pastix, though. Yes, he did. All we've got to do is sit back and wait. We're going to have people come to us, Lewis. We're losing nothing. Just one thing you can do on your way home, though. Look in at Lonsdale, will you? Try and find out if our friend Harding had any visitors in his rooms last night. And if so, how many, and who they were. On this final night of the Mikado, David Michael's mind was distanced. He recalled that phone call the previous evening, after which he'd driven down to Oxford into Lonsdale College and Harding's rooms, where McBride had already arrived and where Daly was to appear within minutes. Over a year it had been since they'd met. It was that bloody letter in the paper that had stirred it all up again, as well as that man Morse. What a shock it had been when they'd found the body, since he, Michaels, had no idea whatsoever it had been there at all. Bad luck, certainly. What a slice of good luck, though, that he'd found the antler-handled knife, because no one was ever going to find that again, lying deep as it was in the lake at Blenheim Park. The situation was beginning to right itself again, or rather had been so beginning, until he'd taken the second phone call, early that very morning, a call from that cesspit of a specimen out at Begbrook. But Daly could wait for a while. Why was Morse waiting? That made him very uneasy. It was not until gone 11 a.m. on Monday the 3rd of August that Chief Inspector Harold Johnson read the transcript of Harding's evidence, then reread it. He turned to a map of the house and grounds at Blenheim. There it was, the lake. Quite suddenly he had the urge to go back there. He drove out to Woodstock and up to the gate, where a keeper sat in his box, and where Johnson was recognised. "I thought we had one of our lads on each of the gates." "Right, you did, Sue, but you took them off. When was that?" "Saturday." Johnson drove on through, and there it was again, bringing back so many memories. Johnson was far from happy about the statement he'd just read. It seemed that Daly, a year ago, had been decidedly uneconomical with the truth, and that, to Johnson, was irksome, very irksome. He wanted another word with Daly, now. He drove down past the palace to the garden centre, but no one there had seen Daly that morning. Might be out at the mill, perhaps? He soon learned that Daly's van wasn't there either. Hadn't been there since Friday afternoon, in fact. The odds were that Daly was planting trees by the lake that morning. Johnson drove to the edge of the estate, then right along a lane that proclaimed no thoroughfare, till he reached Coombe Lodge, where Johnson had been told the gate would probably be locked. Johnson read the notice on the tall wooden green-painted gate. "Access for key holders only. Do not disturb the residents in the lodge." But there was no need for him to disturb the single resident, since a tractor-cum-trailer had just been admitted, and in its wake the police car was waved through without challenge. Immediately in front of him, the road divided sharply, and as a lone, overweight lady eating pace took the fork to the right, Johnson took the fork to the left, towards the northern tip of the lake. Very soon he saw a Blenheim estate van pulled in beside an old felt-roofed hut. He got out of the car to look through a small side window of glass. Nothing. Then, as he stepped further round, something caught the right-hand edge of his vision, and he looked down at the ground just beyond and behind the hut. His mouth suddenly opening in horror, his body held momentarily in the freezing grip of fear. At the time that Chief Inspector Johnson had set out for Woodstock, Lewis was driving along the A40 to Cheltenham. It appeared to have been a late, impulsive decision on Morse's part. "You realise, Lewis, that the only person we've not bothered about in this case so far is Auntie, whatever her name is, from Llandovery." "Well, not an auntie exactly, sir. You know, it's like when little girls sometimes call women their aunties." "No, I don't know, Lewis." "Well, it seems Karen called her Auntie Dot, or Doss, this Mrs. Evans." It had been after Cheltenham, after Gloucester and Ross-on-Wye, after Monmouth and the stretch of beautiful countryside between Brecon and Llandovery, that Morse had come to life again. "That statement, Lewis, that statement Harding made," he said. "They obviously got together, the four of them, Harding, Daly, Michaels and McBride, got together and cooked up a story between them. Your porter couldn't give us any names, you say, but he's pretty sure there were at least 3, probably 4 of them in Harding's rooms on Friday night." He went on, "There was only one really important clue in this case. The fact that the Swedish girl's rucksack was found so quickly. Had to be found. Left beside the roadside, sure to be found." "I think I'm beginning to see that," said Lewis, unseeing. Mrs. Evans, a smallish, dark, sprightly woman in her late 40s, showed them into the parlour. She, Mrs. Evans, was no blood relation at all, but had become friendly with the Ericsson family when they had stayed in the guest house in Aldborough 8 or 9 years ago. To the 3 young Ericsson girls, she had become Auntie Doss. When Karen had decided to come to England in 1991, Mrs. Evans had suggested to her mother that there would always be a welcome for Karen in Wales, and a bed. What sort of girl was Karen? Of course, she'd only been 13 or 14 when she'd seen her last, but, well, lovely, really. Lovely girl. Attractive. Very proper, though. "Proper?" said Morse. "Do you mean prim and proper?" "No, I don't mean that. But she was... Well, her mother said she'd always got plenty of boyfriends, like. But she knew... Well, she knew when to draw the line, let's put it like that." "What was Karen like in school? Interested in sport, was she? Tennis?" "Oh, she loved tennis." "Edberg," she said. "Stefan Edberg. He's a great hero." "She must have been very disappointed about Wimbledon last year, I should think, then." "Oh, she was, yes. She told me she—" Suddenly Mrs. Evans' left hand shot up to her mouth, and for many seconds she sat immobile in her chair, as if she'd caught a glimpse of the Gorgon. "Don't worry," said Morse quietly. "Sergeant Lewis will take it all down." The car telephone rang, and Morse himself picked it up. Lewis could hear just Morse's syncopated roll. "What? You sure?" "Bloody hell." "Who?" "Bloody hell." "Yes. Yes. 2.5 hours, I should think. No, leave things exactly as they are." Morse put down the phone like a despondent zombie. "They found a body." "Who?" "George Daly, shot through the heart." "Where?" Blenheim Park." "You reckon he was killed instantly?" asked Morse. Dr. Laura Hobson nodded. "It was possibly one of those 7mm bullets." Morse turned his eyes away from the body on the ground, and for a few moments stood staring around him in that quiet woodland glade where so very recently someone had shot George Daly in the back. And the owners of 7mm rifles? Morse knew 2 of them, David Michaels and George Daly himself. "Any idea how long?" asked Morse. Dr. Hobson smiled. "That's the very first question you always asked Max." "He told you?" "Yes." 10, 12 hours. I'll plump for 10. Morse looked at his wristwatch. 8:25 p.m. That put the murder at about 10 a.m., say? 10:30 a.m.? Yes, that sort of time would figure reasonably well. Lewis was suddenly at his side, bending down and picking up the khaki green pork pie hat Daly invariably wore on freezing winter mornings and sweltering summer days alike. "Mr. Williams, the keeper there," Lewis pointed back in the direction of Coombe Lodge, "says he thinks he may remember a bit of pop sometime this morning." "Oh, bloody marvellous," said Morse. "He thinks he remembers Daly going through sometime in the morning, but there's always quite a few estate vans. He thinks a lot, your keeper, doesn't he? And 1 or 2 joggers, he says." The house in which the Dalys had lived for the past 18 years was deserted. Margaret Daly, so the neighbours said, was away. 2 important pieces of evidence were found immediately. The first was a letter from the Oxford Magistrates' Court, dated 31st of July, informing Mr. G. Daly of the charges to be preferred against his son Philip,
and of the various legal liabilities which he, the father, would now incur under the new Aggravated Vehicle Theft Act. The second piece of evidence was a note from a temporarily departed son, as it appeared, to a now permanently departed father, conveying only the simple message that he was off to try and sort something out. In the lounge, Lewis pointed to the row of black videocassettes. "I should think we know what's on some of them, sir." Morse nodded. "Upstairs, sir? The boys' room?" "No. I think we've done enough for one night." As they left the house, both detectives noticed that the 7mm rifle which had earlier stood on its butt by the entrance had now disappeared. "I reckon it's about time we had a quick word with Michaels," said Morse, as in the thickening light they got into the car. At the White Hart, David Michaels was seated on a stool in the downstairs bar with Bobby at his feet. "Could we have a word with you, sir?" said Lewis. "What about?" asked Michaels. "Just one thing, really," replied Morse. "You've heard about Daly's murder?" "Yes." "Well, I want to take a look in your rifle cabinet, that's all." "When we finish our drinks?" "I'd like Sergeant Lewis to go up and—" "Fine. I'd better just give Kathy a ring, though. She'll have the place bolted." Morse saw little objection, it seemed. "Am I a suspect?" asked Michaels with a wan smile after Lewis had left. "Yes," said Morse, simply draining his beer. "And I want you to come up to Kidlington HQ in the morning, about 10 o'clock, if that's all right." A very clean and shining Mrs. Michaels, a crimson bathrobe around her body, a white towel round her head, let Sergeant Lewis in immediately. She handed him the cabinet key, then stood aside as if very carefully he lifted the rifle from its stand and placed it in a transparent plastic container. Holding the rifle now by the middle of the barrel, Lewis thanked Mrs. Michael and left. For a while Lewis wondered what she must be thinking, and he suddenly realized that whilst he was there she'd spoken not a single word. In London, Philip Daly stood up and counted the coins. At 6:30 p.m. he had been seated against the wall of an office building in Southampton Row, with a grey and orange scarf arranged in front of him, to receive a stream of coins, as he trusted, of compassionate passers-by. One of the Oxford boys had told him that a cold and hungry notice was best, but the early summer evening was balmy and warm, and anyway, it didn't matter much, not that first night. He had £45 in his pocket, and certainly had no intention of letting himself get too hungry. At 9 o'clock, the coins amounted to only 83p. Kathy Michaels repeatedly bent forwards, sideways, backwards, as the heat from the dryer penetrated her thick, raven-black hair, specially cut for the Mikado in a horizontal bob, the original blonde just beginning to show again. For a moment, she'd felt sure she'd heard the Land Rover just outside, and she turned off the dryer. False alarm. Suddenly she felt fear almost palpably creeping across her skin like some soft-footed, menacing insect. The next day, David Michaels was being held for questioning, Lewis informed him, about two matters. First, about the statement made to the police by Dr. Alan Harding, a copy of which was now handed to him. Second, about the murder of George Daly. Michaels began reading Harding's statement. "Well?" asked Lewis. "That's about the size of it, yes." "You're quite happy to corroborate it?" "Why not?" "We'll have to ask you to make your own statement." "Can't I just copy this one out?" Lewis grinned weakly, but shook his head. "Now, last time you pretended you'd not got the faintest idea where anybody might be found, right?" "Yes," lied Michaels. "And then this time round you still pretended you didn't really know?" "Yes," lied Michaels. "So why did you nudge Chief Inspector Morse in the right direction?" "Double bluff, wasn't it? No one was going to think I'd anything to do with the murder." "Who told you it was murder?" "The chap standing there on guard at Pastex." "Why didn't you dump the rucksack in the lake as well?"
continued Lewis. For the first time, Michaels hesitated. Should have done, I agree. Was it because Daly had his eye on the camera and the binoculars? Well, one thing's for sure. He won't be able to tell you, will he? You don't sound as if you like him very much. He was a filthy, mean-minded little swine. But you didn't know him very well, surely? No, I hardly knew him at all. Well, you'd never met him previously at your little rendezvous in Parktown? No, I'd only just joined, lied Michaels. Look, Sergeant, I'm not proud of that. But haven't you ever wanted to watch a sex film? I've seen plenty. But I'd rather have a plate of egg and chips myself. You wouldn't want your wife to know about it, would you, Mr. Michaels? No, I wouldn't want her to know anything like that, said Michaels quietly. Daly was killed from a 7mm gun, like as not. Well, every forester's got a rifle of that sort of caliber. So where were you between, say, 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock yesterday morning? I was with a couple of fellas from the RSPB. They were checking on the nesting boxes along the singing way. But you were helping them, carrying the bloody ladder most of the time. What about after that? Well, we all nipped down the White Hart, about 12, quarter past. You've got the addresses of these fellas? Oh, I can get them for you easy enough. And the barman there at the pub, he knows you? Rather too well, Sergeant. At 12:30 p.m, Dr. Hobson rang through from the South Parks Road to say that whilst she was an amateur in the byways of ballistics, she would be astounded if Michael's gun had been fired at any time within the previous few weeks. The terrible news that her husband had been murdered and that her only son had run away from home had left Margaret Daly not so much devastated as dumbfounded. It had helped a bit talking with the Chief Inspector. Not that she'd bared her soul too much to him about the increasing repugnance she'd felt for the man she'd married, and the shallow, devious, cruel nature of his character. There had been Philip, though, and for so long the little lad had compensated in manifold ways for the declining love and respect she was feeling for her husband. Soon after Philip had started at secondary school, George had begun to assert his influence over the boy, and in some ways to steal his affection from her. Progressively there had been a coarsening of Philip's speech and of his attitudes. The brittle laughter between father and son about jokes to which she was never privy, reports from school which grew worse and worse. Then, over a year ago, that almighty row between father and son about the rucksack. Exactly what had happened then she was still uncertain, but she knew that her husband had lied about the time and place he'd found the rucksack. She knew George had found the rucksack somewhere, or that someone had given it to him on that very Sunday when the Swedish girl had gone missing. That Sunday when George had been out all afternoon, and then out again later in the evening, drinking heavily, as she recalled. It must have been that Sunday evening, too, when Philip had found the rucksack, probably at the back of the garage, where she knew he'd been looking for his climbing boots, and where, as she suspected, he'd found the camera and the binoculars. Oh yes, she was on very firm ground there, because she too had found them in Philip's room. A good deal of this information Morse had known already. She sensed that. He'd not asked her how she knew about the photographs, yet he surely must have guessed. But he would never know about those other photographs, the pornographic ones. No. She would tell Morse nothing about that. Nor about the joyriding and her mental turmoil when she'd first read the words in Philip's diary. Words which conjured up for her the confused images of squealing tyres and the anguished shrieks of a small girl lying in a pool of her own blood. Just after lunchtime, Morse was back in his office at HQ, listening to the tape of Michael's interview. What do you think, sir? I don't see how he could have done it. No time, was there? Who did kill him, do you think? Well, there are 3 things missing from his house, aren't there? Daly himself, the rifle, and the boy. The son, Philip. You think he killed him? Killed his father, like Oedipus? The things I've taught you, Lewis. Did he love his mum as well? Very much so, I think. But why? Why, do you think? In that letter, I suppose, from the Crown Court. What, and his dad refused to help? Probably.
Well, he told his son to clear off, like as not. Where do we go from here, then? Nowhere. For a bit. Where are you going now? Asked Harding. Back to London, said Alistair McBride. Can I give you a lift to the station? I'd be glad of that. The two walked out of the Trout Inn at Wolvercote. What will you do, Alan? Asked McBride. I don't know. I don't really care. Don't say that. McBride laid his right hand lightly on the driver's arm, but Harding dismissed the gesture as if he were flicking a fly from his sleeve. Back in Radcliffe Square, Harding went straight up to his rooms in Lonsdale. He knew her number off by heart. Claire? It's me, Alan. I know it's you. I was wondering, just hoping... No! You mean you're not even going to see me again? That's it. Not ever? His throat was suddenly very dry. You know, for a university don, you don't pick some things up very quickly, do you? Claire Osborne sat by the phone for several minutes after she had rung off. Had she been too cruel to Alan? The poorly typed letter, no salutation, no subscription, she had received with a cassette that morning, was lying on the coffee table, and already she'd read it 20-odd times. I enjoyed so much our foreshortened time together, you and the music. One day of the great lost days, one face of all the faces. Ernest Dowson, not me. A memento herewith. The recordare is my favourite bit. Recordare, by the way, is the second-person singular of the present imperative of the verb recordor. It means remember. You sure about all this, Morse? Strange's voice was very sceptical. Completely sure. You said that about Michaels. No, I only said I was 90% sure on that. Okay, Strange shrugged his shoulders. What first put you onto it? For a few moments Morse paused dubiously. Several things, I suppose. For example, I once heard someone claim that all three types of British woodpeckers could be found in Whittam Woods. I think I heard it in a pub. Morse got up and walked to the door. You know, it's a bit surprising no one ever noticed her accent, isn't it? I bet you I'll notice it. He'd admitted to acquaint Strange with the biggest clue of all, but it had formed for him, Morse, the focal point of all the mystery. The normal murderer would seek to cover up all traces of his victim. So in that case, why had he been so anxious for the rucksack and associated possessions to be found? The rucksack was found very soon. The hunt for Karen's murderer was underway very soon. Now, if a young Swedish student goes missing, sans everything, then there is always less than certitude that she is dead. But if a young girl goes missing, and at the same time her possessions are discovered in a hedgerow somewhere nearby, then the implications are all too painfully obvious, the conclusions all too readily drawn. Though not by Morse. After all, the key question was, why was the murderer so anxious for the police to pursue a murder inquiry? To that strange question, Morse now knew the answer. Because the police would be looking for a body, not for someone who was still alive. 10 minutes later, Lewis was ready for him, and together the two detectives drove out to Whittam Woods once more. There were 4 of them in the living room of the low-ceilinged cottage. Morse and Lewis seated side by side on the leather settee, Mrs. Michaels opposite them in an armchair, and the uniformed WPC Wright standing by the door. "Word here about your marriage, Mrs. Michaels," said Morse. "There's something slightly, irregular about it." "Really?" "David Michaels discovered that the district office for anyone living in Whittam was at Abingdon, and he went there and answered all the usual questions about when and where you wanted to marry, how old you both were, where you were both born, whether either of you had been married before. And that was that. 2 days later you were married." "So?" Well, everything is really based on trust in things like that. It's easy to get married by license if you're willing to abuse the system. You are saying that we, David and I, we abused the system? There was only one thing that couldn't be fiddled in your case. Date of birth. You see, some documentation is statutory in that respect, if the person concerned is a foreign national. A silence now hung over the small room. Did you have to show your passport to the registrar at Abingdon? There was no need for that. I'm not a foreign national. No? No. My name was Catherine Adams. I was born in Uppingham, in Rutland. I'm 24 years old. Can I see your passport? Asked Morse quietly. As a matter of fact, you can't. It's in the post to Swansea. We're going, me and David, to Italy in September. Don't worry. We've already got a copy, you see. The Swedish embassy sent us one. He read again. Katarina Adams, height 168 centimetres in her stockinged feet. Of the female sex, born on the 29th of September 1968 in Uppsala, Sweden. Adams was your married name. Your first married name. And when your husband was killed in a car crash, you kept it. Why not? So what else do you want from me? She asked quietly. Just tell me the truth, please. She took a deep breath and spoke quickly and briefly. When my sister Karen was murdered, I was in Spain, in Barcelona as it happened. I got here as soon as I could. My mother had rung me from Sweden, but I could do nothing. I soon realized that. I met David. We fell in love. We were married. I was frightened about work permits and visas and that sort of thing, and David said it would be better if I lied, if he lied, about my earlier marriage. What would you do if you ever lost your passport? She shrugged. I don't know. I'd apply to the Swedish embassy, I suppose. Let me ask you a simple question. Would it be possible for anyone to apply for someone else's passport? Almost impossible, surely. There are all sorts of checks in Sweden. Civic registration number, photograph. No. I agree with you, I think. There is another way, though. A very much easier way of acquiring a passport. A childishly easy way. Someone gives you one, Mrs. Michaels. Someone sends you one through the post. You're leaving me many miles behind, Inspector. No, I'm not, replied Morse. You and your eldest sister are very much alike, aren't you? My sergeant here brought me a photograph of the three of you from Stockholm. That passport there isn't yours. It belongs to your sister Katarina Adams. Your sister who still lives in Uppsala. Name isn't Katarina Adams at all, is it, Mrs. Michaels? It's Karen Eriksson. Her shoulders sagged. But Morse was pressing home his advantage. You've got beautiful legs, would you agree? What? Instinctively she sought to pull the hem of her knee-length skirt an inch or two lower over her elegant legs. She was almost at the end of her tether. Please, tell me, what are you accusing me of? Resignedly, Morse gestured with his right hand to Lewis, and Lewis, in a flat and melancholy voice, intoned the charge. Mrs. Karen Michaels, Miss Karen Eriksson, I have to inform you that you are under police arrest on suspicion of murdering one James Myton on the afternoon of Sunday, July the 7th, 1991. She interrupted. You mean you're accusing me? Me? Of being Karen, my sister, the sister who was murdered? You're still denying it? Queried Morse quietly. Of course I am. You can prove it, you know. On the passport, the one you say is yours, it says in Swedish, pronounced diagonal scar, inner thigh above left kneecap, result of motoring accident. Yes? So if you haven't a scar there, then you're not now and never were the woman described on that passport. Karen Eriksson, the murderer of James Myton, now sat completely still for many agonizing seconds. Then slowly, tantalizingly as if she were some upper-class artiste in a striptease parlour. Her left hand lifted the hem of the beige velvet skirt above her left knee to reveal the naked flesh upon her inner thigh. And as Morse looked down at the smooth and unscarred flesh above her knee, he found himself wondering for a little while whether he too, like Myton, might not at some point on a hot and sultry summer afternoon have found this girl so very beautiful and necessary. From the combined statements of Karen Eriksson and of her wholly legitimate husband David, it was a straightforward matter to stitch together a sequence of events that had occurred on Sunday the 7th of July 1991. On the M40, Karen had almost immediately been picked up. Dropped off at the Headington roundabout, she'd been picked up again and dropped at the Banbury Road roundabout. Walking a few hundred yards down the Banbury Road, she had noticed the attractive-looking Cotswold house, and on impulse she'd knocked and inquired the rates. She'd been told that there was one single-room vacancy, but on learning the tariff had decided to find something a little cheaper, a little later. From a phone box she had phoned the model agency, and fairly soon been collected and driven down to Abingdon Road, where a telephone arrangement was made with McBride for Karen to present herself at Second Villa at about 2 p.m. for an hour or so's photographic session. The fee suggested £80 to £120, causing her eyebrows to lift in pleasurable surprise. At Second Villa she had been admitted by McBride, and soon introduced to Myton. No hard pornography, but yes, she was willing to pose for a series of nude and semi-nude studies, and for an extra £20 she'd agreed that 2 other men there could sit in the studio and watch her. Myton, she learned, was a freelance cinematographer in the sex video world, but it seemed all right. Whilst he was preparing his paraphernalia, she had wandered out briefly into the back garden, and when he'd come out a little while later, she'd found him amusing, good fun. She'd asked him to stand by the wall there while she could take a couple of snaps. Soon, though, McBride had hurriedly ushered them inside, where she was introduced perfunctorily to a man in a lightweight summer suit, and another man in grey slacks and sports jacket, incongruously holding a green pork-pie hat. Then, the session. She had, she confessed, experienced some flush of excitement as the 2 silent men, McBride had only come in later, ogled her as she stripped and posed and lay on the bed in gaping gowns. Afterwards, when she and Myton were alone, she'd asked him to take 1 or 2 snaps of her with her own camera, and he'd readily done so. He'd asked her if she'd wanted a lift anywhere. After McBride had paid her the £100, Myton had driven her back up to the top of the Banbury Road. She told him that she was thinking of going to the charity pop concert at Blenheim the next evening, the 8th of July. And then, suddenly, as they were passing the Cotswold house, she asked him to stop. She would stay there now. But sadly, the remaining room had been taken. From the car, she thought she saw a sparrowhawk. Fatal moment. Myton asked her if she was interested in bird-watching, and she had shown him the list of the hoped-for spottings. Well, he knew exactly where she could see the woodpecker. He was interested in birds himself. That was the beginning of all her woe. In Witham Woods they had walked into a thickly forested area, and then Myton's hands were upon her body. Very soon he'd grown rough and insistent, and told her that he needed her, urgently, would have her. He'd stripped off her thin blouse and pulled her to the floor, but she was herself strong and determined in fighting him off. The pocket of the rucksack in which she kept her binoculars and her knife was still open, and she managed to struggle away from him and open the blade of the knife and plunge it into him. He lay still, utterly still, his eyes wide open and glaring up at her. She hurled the knife into the trees, picked up her scarlet rucksack, and, dressed only in blood-spattered skirt, she fled the spot in panic. She ran and ran. She could have no idea how long, how far, before collapsing and remembering nothing more, until she looked up to see a dog, and a thick-set, bearded man behind the dog, his face anxious and kindly, looking down at her. A Land Rover was parked a few yards away. In his cottage, David Michaels at first had found it scarcely possible to believe the young woman's extraordinary account of what had occurred. It all seemed like some terrible nightmare, she pleaded. The mention of the word police had driven her to hysterical tears, and clearly distressing too was the thought of the car that from his cottage window Michaels could see even then across the lane. But he would deal with things. He'd promised her that, not knowing what he had promised. He learned from her of Seckham Villa, and he made his decision. He got her to bath herself, to swallow 6 disprin, and very soon she had fallen deeply asleep, quite naked between the white sheets of his own double bed. At Seckham Villa, Michaels had met the 3 of them, still there, McBride, Daly, and Harding. A plan was conceived and later executed. Just one detail that was new. Curran's intended visit to the pop concert at Blenheim could be used to their ready advantage, since the discovery of the rucksack and the other personal possessions somewhere near Blenheim the day after the concert would throw everyone on the wrong scent. That night, back in the cottage on the edge of the woods, Curran had become terrifyingly distraught. She'd sought throughout that night the reassurance of David's embrace and of his love, and gladly, gloriously he had met her needs. It had been her plan, her plea to go to Wales, away somewhere, away anywhere, and the next morning he had driven there, leaving her in the hands of kindly Auntie Doss. From Wales she had telephoned David frequently. She it was, Curran, who had phoned her mother, together with whom, and with her sisters, the next phase of the plan was conceived, the simple substitute passport. Finally, there had been the return to Oxford, and to David Michaels, the man she was learning increasingly to love. With her hair cut and dyed black, she lived in the cottage in an idyllic state of happiness with David and Bobby. And then marriage. Strange, really, that she could live so happily so near the murder. Yet she could. The nightmare had passed. For the first 6 months or so, David had daily expected to discover the body. But no.
And when Morse had asked him where he himself might think of hiding a body,
it had never occurred to him that Curran would have run so far, so very far from Pastix, out along by the Singing Way. But just one more thing. Uncommonly for Swedish people, the Eriksson family were all Roman Catholic, something Lewis had suspected when he'd seen the 2 crucifixes, but sadly something he hadn't mentioned to Morse. And Karen had discovered the little church in the Woodstock Road. She was in the habit of going to Mass on Sunday mornings, twice a month or so. Then confession, because of her slowly formulating fear that her lack of contrition at having killed Mighton was almost a greater sin than the killing itself had been. Yet, at the same time, an oddly contradictory wish was gradually growing too, even that someone would divulge that truth. But Father Richards would never do that, he said, as he prayed with her. That night, Morse lay awake thinking about his failure thus far to locate the bullet that had killed George Daly. The bullet had been fired from about 60 or so yards. That seemed a firm assumption. So why hadn't it been found? The phone rang, and Morse grabbed at it. Well, that was quick, sir. What do you want, Lewis? The Met, sir. Well? Young Philip Daly, sir. Just over an hour ago. Threw himself under a westbound train on the Central line, it seems. Driver had no chance, just as he came out of the tunnel. Morse said nothing. That's not all you've got to tell me, is it? He then said quietly. No, sir, you've guessed, I suppose. That was Monday morning. You're telling me he couldn't have shot his dad, is that it? Not even if he'd been the one to hire a helicopter, sir. All along he'd been aware of his dissatisfaction with the motivation of Philip Daly for the death of his father. It could have happened that way, of course. But the sequence of sudden hatred and carefully plotted murder rang far from true, and Morse considered once more the original facts. the scene of George Daly's murder, beside the little coppice in Blenheim Park, still cordoned off. Odd, really, that. No one had come up with anything. And suddenly he knew why. He jerked up in bed. What exactly made him remember Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, he was by no means sure. He looked Heisenberg up in his encyclopedia. There is always an uncertainty in the values obtained if simultaneous observation is made of position. Morse nodded to himself, and was soon asleep. You appreciate, therefore, Lewis, the two of them stood on the scene of Daly's murder the following morning, the paramount importance of leaving everything exactly as it was here. But we've had everybody trampling all over the place. Morse beamed. Ah, but we've got this, haven't we? He patted the roof of the Blenheim estate van affectionately. That's enough here, Lewis. Let's get over to the lodge. It's time we had another word with Mr. Williams. As before, Williams' evidence in specific terms was perhaps unsatisfactory, but the crucial point, that Daly had driven through Coombe Lodge Gate on the morning of his murder, could be pretty confidently reaffirmed. There'd been a good deal of toing and froing of two blue tractors with their trailers that morning, and if there was one thing he could feel reasonably confident about, it was the fact that Daly had come through the gate at the same time as one of the tractors, because although the gate was opened quite frequently that morning, it had not been specifically opened, Williams was almost sure, for the estate van. He did remember the van, though. He hadn't known Daly well, but Daly almost always wore his hat, even in the summer, and, yes, Daly had been wearing his hat that Monday morning. Mr. Williams, pressed Morse, I'm sorry to keep on about this, but it's very important. I know that Mr. Daly always wore his hat around the park, but are you sure it was Mr. Daly who was wearing the hat on Monday morning? You mean, said William slowly, you mean it might have been him driving the van? Exactly. Oh dear. Williams didn't know, hadn't even considered. Two women joggers appeared at the lodge. Morse asked his last question. Did you notice any jogger coming this way out of the park on Monday morning? About, let's say, 10:30, 11? Williams pondered the question. The Chief Inspector had just sparked off a fairly vivid recollection. He thought he could remember a woman. Could see her now, with the nipples of her breasts erect. Was that Monday morning, though? I may have done, yes. Thank you very much, sir. The car park at Whittam was packed with police cars and vans, when half an hour after leaving Blenheim, Lewis drove through the perimeter gate. Here, under the direction of Chief Inspector Johnson, some 50 or so policemen were systematically conducting their search. No luck yet? Asked Morse. Give us a chance, said Johnson. They would find it. Johnson was confident of that. Morse led the way up the curving track towards the furthest point from the compound entrance, towards the hut where David Michaels had his office. He looked back down the sloping track, retraced his steps, counting as he went, then stopped at a smaller open-sided shed in which stood a large red tractor. For a minute or two he stood beside the tractor, behind the shed wall, and then, as if he were a young boy with an imaginary rifle, lifted both his arms, curled his right index finger around an imaginary trigger, and slowly turned the rifle in an arc from right to left, as if some imaginary vehicle was being driven past. The rifle finally remaining stationary as the vehicle's imaginary driver dismounted in front of the head forester's hut. You reckon? Asked Lewis quietly. Morse nodded. That means we probably ought to be concentrating the search up there, sir. Lewis pointed back towards Michael's office. The pair of them walked down to the low stone-built cottage where until very lately Michael and his Swedish wife had lived so happily together. Inside the cottage, just beside the main entrance, stood the steel security cabinet, from which Michael's rifle had been taken for forensic examination. It now stood open and empty. Lewis bent down and looked carefully at the groove in which the rifle had stood, noting the scratches where the butt had rested, and beside it a second groove, with equally telltale signs. "I'm sure you're right," said Lewis. "If you remember," said Morse, "he told us himself, Michaels did. When you told him you'd seen no rifles in the hut, he said, oh, but I couldn't keep them there. Those were his exact words, I think." "Well, you still certainly did it, sir." "Yes." "Put you onto it this time?" asked Lewis, as they sat opposite each other in the small upstairs bar of the White Hart. "It was the photographs they took of Daly at Blenheim. I got the idea somehow that he'd just been dumped there, that he hadn't been shot there at all. And we had the hat, didn't we? The hat Daly wore wherever he was, whatever the weather. Same bloody hat. He never took it off, Lewis. Probably took it off in bed. You see," went on Morse, "he was almost certainly wearing his hat when he was shot. And even if it had fallen off when he dropped dead, I just had the feeling—" Lewis lifted his eyebrows. "Well, it wouldn't have fallen far." So I reckon it was put down there deliberately, just beside his head, after he was shot. Remember where it was?" "What a palaver!" Morse nodded. "But they had to do it. They had to establish an alibi." "For David Michaels, you mean?" "Yes. It was Michaels who shot Daly, I've no doubts on that score. There was the agreement Harding told us about, wasn't there, the statement the four of them made. Then something comes along and buggers it all up. Daly got a letter spelling out his financial responsibilities for his boy, and Daly knew that he was the one who had a hold over, well, over all the others, really, but particularly over David Michaels. Blackmail. Exactly. Quite a hold over Michaels, though, when you think of it, knowing he was married to a murderess. Quite a hold. So, Michaels agrees, pretends he agrees to go along with it. They'll meet at Whittam earlyish on Monday, 10:15, say. No one around much at that time, no bird watchers allowed in the woods till 10, remember the notice? The RSPB people were there. Oh, they turned out to be a blessing in disguise, though. No, take it a bit slower, please. Right. Daly drives up to Whittam. Michaels has said he'll have some money ready. He's ready. He waits for Daly to drive up to his office. He waits for a clear view of him as he gets out of his estate van. Someone as experienced as Michaels with a telescopic sight could hit this. Morse picked up his empty glass from 100, let alone 50 yards. But any further reconstruction of Daly's murder was temporarily curtailed since Johnson had walked in and now sat down. "There's this call for you from forensics about the van. They found prints all over the shop, mostly Daly's, of course. But like you said, they found other prints on the tailboard, on the steering wheel." "And was I right about them?" Johnson nodded. "Yes, they're Carr and Erickson's." At 3:25 p.m., now more than 4 or 5 yards from the spot where Chief Inspector Johnson had earlier stood, there amongst the nettles and the cow parsley, Constable Roy Wilkes made his discovery. A .243 bullet, the bullet surely for which the party had been searching. Never again would Wilkes be likely to experience such felicitous congratulations, most particularly from Morse. "Just simply, Morse, just simply. I don't want to know what a clever sod you are, just a straightforward, brief account." Following the final discoveries, new statements had been taken from both David Michaels and Carr and Erickson. And now, the following morning, as he sat in Strange's office, Morse was able to confirm in nearly every respect the pattern of events he'd outlined to Lewis in the White Hart. Daly had been to the office in Whittam Woods on more than one occasion before, and a meeting had been arranged for 9:45 a.m. on Monday the 3rd of August. At that time there would, with any luck, be virtually no one around, and the deed took place. When Daly got out of his van, Michaels shot him dead with his .243 rifle, the latter buried later out on the Singing Way. The body Michaels had swiftly wrapped in black plastic sheeting and lifted into the back of Daly's own van. Only 2 or 3 minutes after the murder, this same van was being driven out through Wolvercut towards Woodstock, and finally up to Coombe Lodge on the western side of the Blenheim estate. The van driver waited a while, and was very quickly rewarded when the gate was opened for a tractor and trailer. Then the driver, pulling Daly's khaki-green hat down over her short, black hair, moved into the trailer's wake, raising a hand in acknowledgment as she drove gratefully through. A few hundred yards along, she had spotted an ideal location in which to leave the van and a body and a hat. Daly had not been a heavy man, and she herself was a strong young woman, yet she'd been unable to lift the corpse, just pull it over the tailboard, whence it fell with a thud to the hard soil. The plastic seat was messily sticky with blood, and she'd taken it with her as she ran off across the road to the tip of the lake, where she washed the blood from her hands and wedged the sheet between some reeds. Then, following the arranged plan, she jogged her way back, though not, she claimed, through Coombe Lodge, as Morse had suggested, and Williams could have sworn, but down by the western side of the lake, and out of the park via Eagle Lodge. "Hell of a long way, whichever route she took," mumbled Strange. Michaels could never have done it himself, not by himself, that morning. He was off with his RSPB pals at 10 o'clock. There was no way at all that he could have got out to Blenheim, and somehow got back to Whittam. But his wife could. That's what you're saying. His wife did.
That same evening, Morse's celebratory mood was undiminished, and he'd walked down to Summertown immediately after the Archers, and carried back up to his flat 4 bottles of champagne. Strange, Johnson, Lewis, and himself, 4 of them, just for a congratulatory glass or two. Harold Johnson was the first to leave at 9:15 p.m. The procedures surrounding the prosecutions of the 2 suspected murderers, David Michaels and Mrs. Michaels, would be entrusted now to him, since Morse had announced his intention of resuming immediately his truncated furlough, which had begun in the Bay Hotel at Lyme Regis. Next, Strange had struggled to his feet and announced his imminent departure. "Thanks. And enjoy your holiday, if you'll let me. Where are you going this time?"
"I was thinking of Salisbury, sir."
"Why Salisbury?"
Morse hesitated. "They've just tarted up the cathedral there, and I thought... You're not going religious on me, Morse?" "No more, for me," said Lewis. "Would you prefer a Newcastle brown?" "I think I would, to be honest, sir." "Come on, then." Morse led the way through to the cluttered kitchen. "You trying for my job, sir?" Lewis pointed to the ancient portable typewriter. "Ah, that! I was just writing a brief line of thanks to the... Would you like me to retype it for you, sir? It's a bit... Yes, please, I'd be grateful for that." So Lewis sat there at the kitchen table and retyped the brief, messy letter. It took him rather longer than it should have done. He kept finding himself examining the worn top segment of the lowercase e, and the slight curtailment of the crossbar in the lowercase t. As he handed the complete copy to Morse, he said, "You remember, sir, that original article in the Times, when they said the typewriter could easily be identified if ever it was found, from the e's and the t's?" "Yes." "You wrote those verses about the girl yourself, didn't you, sir?" Morse nodded slowly. "Bloody hell." Lewis shook his head incredulously. Morse poured himself a can of beer. "Think anyone else suspected?" asked Lewis, grinning down at the typewriter. Just the one person. Someone from Salisbury.